Montana. Autumn 1877. 8 women stood on overturned freight crates in a reeking saloon displayed like livestock at auction. The crowd's laughter turned ugly as the broker jabbed a thumb toward the thin, pale girl at the end of the line. This one's mute. Who's bidding? Silence. Then crueler laughter. Then a single silver dollar hit the bar top, cracked cold and final as a gunshot. This is the story of a man who bought a woman's freedom with a single silver dollar and the woman who used nothing but her mind to save them both. Watch now to find out what happens next. The train arrived late, the way everything arrived late, in Oakhaven. It came grinding and hissing into the depot just past 4 in the afternoon, dragging a gray plume of smoke across a Montana sky that couldn't decide between winter and something worse. The platform filled fast. Men in mud-caked boots and greasy hats crowded forward, craning their necks, pushing for position. Some of them were drunk already. Most of them were lonely. All of them were eager in the particular way that men become eager when they've been out on the frontier long enough to forget what a woman's voice sounds like. Weston Gage stood apart from the crowd. He leaned against the far post of the depot awning, with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pulled low, watching the whole scene the way a man watches a fire he didn't start and doesn't intend to put out. He was 34 years old and looked older. His face was weathered to the color of old saddle leather, scored with fine lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into wind and sun and gun smoke. He had a cavalry scar along his jawline that he never talked about, and a way of standing absolutely still that made most men uncomfortable. He wasn't here for a wife. He'd lost 2 good ranch hands to a silver strike-up near Helena, and his third, a Mexican drover named Cord, had broken his collarbone trying to break a gelding 3 weeks back. The broken spur needed help, real help. Someone who could cook, mend gear, maybe keep the ledger books while Wes and Dakota worked the herd through the worst of calving season. He'd heard there were women on this train looking for honest work and a fresh start. He figured he could offer them both. That was the plan anyway. The depot doors opened, and the women came out single file, shepherded by a broad, sweating man in a checkerboard vest who kept clapping his hands together and grinning like he was running a carnival attraction instead of whatever this actually was. His name, Wes would later learn, was Silas Pratt. He was a mail-order broker out of St. Louis, and he had the eyes of a man who had long ago stopped seeing people as people. There were 8 women total. They looked exhausted. They looked frightened. They looked the way people look when they've traveled a very long way and arrived somewhere that is nothing like what they were promised. Most of them were young. They clutched their bags against their chests and squinted against the cold afternoon light, while Silas guided them toward the saloon across the street, talking the whole time in a loud, cheerful voice about opportunity and new beginnings. Wes watched and said nothing. He pushed off the post and followed at a distance. The saloon was called the Silver Strike, though there was nothing silver about it. It smelled of stale whiskey, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the particular sourness of too many unwashed men in an enclosed space. The floor was sticky underfoot. The bar top was scarred oak, dark with age, and stains in places that nobody wanted to think too hard about. Someone had strung a row of lanterns along the back wall in what Wes assumed was an attempt at festivity. It just made the shadows deeper. Silas had improvised a stage out of 2 overturned freight crates near the back. He herded the women up onto it and then turned to face the crowd, spreading his arms wide. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the westbound has delivered." The crowd cheered. Men pressed forward. The noise in the room climbed. Wes stayed near the door, his back to the wall, one hand resting loosely near his hip. He looked at each of the women on the crates in turn. He was looking for something specific. Not beauty, not youth. He was looking for steadiness. Someone who wouldn't break under the isolation of a mountain winter. Then Silas reached the last woman on the right, and the crowd changed. The cheering dropped off. A few men started laughing, low and mean. Someone near the front called out, something crude that Wes didn't catch but understood well enough from the way two of the other women flinched. A man near the bar said, loud enough to carry, "What are you supposed to do with that?" She was standing slightly apart from the others, at the far right end of the crates. She was thin, not slender. Thin in the way that means someone has been going without for a while. Her dress was gray and patched at both elbows, and it hung on her frame like it had been made for someone else entirely, someone who had eaten more regularly and slept better, and hadn't spent however many days she'd spent on that train. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up badly, strands of it loose against her pale neck. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, though something in her bearing made her seem both younger and older simultaneously. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at a fixed point somewhere above all their heads, at the back wall or beyond it, her jaw set, and her hands folded in front of her, absolutely still. The noise in the room seemed to wash against her and break apart without touching whatever was happening behind her eyes. Silas cleared his throat. "This one's quiet," he said, and the way he said it made several men laugh again. "Goes by Vance, Cassidy Vance, out of Chicago. She's, he paused. "She doesn't speak." More laughter. A man near Wes muttered, "Damaged goods." Silas shrugged, already losing interest. "Bidding starts at—" "What do you mean she doesn't speak?" Someone called out. "Mute, or close enough." Silas waved a hand. "Takes all kinds, I suppose." The crowd's amusement had curdled into something uglier. Men were talking openly now, dismissing her, making comments that Wes was only half hearing because most of his attention had gone to the woman herself. She still wasn't looking at the crowd, but her hands had tightened. Her fingers had gone white at the knuckles. She was gripping her own wrists behind her back now, hidden from the front, and Wes could see from the angle he was standing at what nobody else seemed to notice. She was terrified. She was absolutely, completely terrified, and she was working very hard not to show it, and she was almost succeeding. And something about that almost broke something open in his chest. He knew what that looked like. He had done it himself on a battlefield in Virginia in the autumn of 1864, standing in a field with bodies all around him, and his hands shaking, and his teeth clenched so hard his jaw had ached for a week afterward. You just keep your face still. You find a point on the horizon, and you fix your eyes on it, and you breathe, and you do not let them see. She wasn't damaged goods. She was surviving. The bidding on the other women had started, and the room was moving now, voices overlapping, Silas calling out numbers, money changing hands. Nobody was bidding on Cassidy Vance. A couple of men drifted toward her end of the crates out of idle curiosity, one of them reaching up to grab her wrist, and she jerked back fast. That was when Wes moved. He crossed the room in about 12 strides, not hurrying, not pushing, just walking with the particular directness of a man who has decided something and is done deliberating about it. He put himself between the man who had grabbed at her in the crates, and he stood there. The man took a step back. Wes turned to the bar. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single coin. He set it down on the stained oak surface with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. A silver dollar, worn smooth on one face from years in his pocket, catching the lamplight just enough to gleam. He looked at Silas. $1, he said. His voice was quiet. That was what made men pay attention to it. It never rose. And the first man who touches her answers to my call. The room went still in the way that rooms go still when the person speaking is the sort of person who means exactly what he says, no more and no less. Silas blinked at the dollar. He looked up at Wes. He looked at the colt on Wes's hip and at Wes's hand, which was resting near it with a casualness that was somehow not casual at all. He looked back at the dollar. "That's highly irregular," Silas said. Wes said nothing. He just waited. Silas picked up the dollar. He bit it, out of habit or nerves or both, and then he nodded once, sharply, and looked away. Wes turned toward the crates. She was looking at him now. For the first time since he'd walked in, she was actually looking directly at someone in this room instead of past them. Her eyes were dark, a deep brown that was almost black in the low lamplight, and they were fixed on him with an expression that he couldn't immediately read. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was closer to assessment. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a door when they're not sure if it leads somewhere safe or somewhere worse. He understood that, too. He took off his coat, the heavy sheepskin one that he'd worn all the way from Fort Benton last January and had never quite gotten around to replacing. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a second. Then she took it, slowly, and put it around her shoulders. It swamped her completely, the hem nearly reaching her knees, the shoulders hanging down over her arms. She pulled it closed at the front. He offered his hand to help her down from the crates because they were high enough and the floor was wet, and it was a reasonable thing to do. She looked at his hand. She stepped down on her own, without taking it, navigating the edge of the crate carefully and landing steady. He noted that, too. He walked her toward the door. The crowd parted, not enthusiastically, but practically, because Wes moved with the kind of gravity that crowds tend to accommodate whether they want to or not. Someone near the back muttered something sour. He didn't turn around. Outside, the cold hit them both. The sun had dropped further while they were inside, and the temperature had dropped with it, the way it does in Montana. In early October, when the evening reminds you that winter isn't coming, it's already here, and simply being polite. The street was quieter. A wagon moved past. A dog trotted along the boardwalk across the way. Cassidy Vance stood beside him on the depot steps and did not move or speak, which was of course to be expected. She had his coat pulled tight around her, and she was staring at the middle distance again, though this time it looked less like survival and more like simply processing a great deal of information very quickly. Wes settled his hat on his head. He looked out at the street. "My name is Weston Gage," he said. "People call me Wes. I've got a ranch about 12 miles northeast of town, up against the Bear Paw foothills. It's not a pretty place. The work is hard, and the winters are harder." He paused. "I went in there looking for help with the ranch. Someone to cook and keep books and pull their weight. I wasn't looking for anything else." He let that sit for a moment. "I still aren't." She said nothing, obviously. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small card, the kind he used when he needed to write down supply orders, and he held it out along with the stub of a pencil. "She took both," he said. "That dollar bought your freedom from those wolves, ma'am. You don't owe me your body. You only owe me your honesty." She looked down at the card. She looked back up at him. Then she wrote something on the card and handed it back. He looked at it. "Where's your ranch?" He almost smiled. He didn't, quite, but it was close. 12 miles northeast, he said again. "I've got a horse and a wagon out back of the livery. We'll need to move before dark if we want to beat the weather." He looked at the sky, which turned the particular heavy gray color that means snow before morning. "You're welcome to come. You're also welcome to stay here in town. Your choice, Miss Vance. I mean that." She stood there for a moment longer, thinking whatever she was thinking behind those careful dark eyes. Then she turned and walked toward the livery without a word, still wearing his coat, her patched dress showing beneath the hem, her worn boots quiet on the boards. He stood there another second, watching her go. Then he followed. The wagon was loaded and moving inside 20 minutes. Wes drove and she sat beside him on the bench, his coat still around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. Dakota met them on the north road, riding ahead on his paint horse, already scouting the trail for ice. He glanced at the woman on the bench, looked at Wes, and said nothing. Dakota was good at reading situations and better at not asking questions that didn't need asking yet. The road climbed into the foothills. The pines closed in on either side. The sky overhead had gone fully dark and gray, and the first snowflakes began to fall, small and light, ticking softly against the canvas behind them. She reached into the pocket of his coat, which she was still wearing, and found the card and the pencil still there. She wrote something and held it out. He took it without looking away from the road. He read it, then looked at it again. "Why did you really do it?" He thought about that for a while. The wagon wheels turned. The snow fell a little harder. Up ahead, Dakota disappeared around a bend in the trail and came back again. Because I know what it feels like, Wes said finally, to be cornered. She took the card back. She didn't write anything else for the rest of the drive, but she stopped looking at the middle distance. She started looking at the road ahead instead, at the dark tree line and the gray sky, and the first faint outline of the Bear Paw Peaks against the clouds. Looking forward, not past. It wasn't much, but on a night like this, coming from a place like that, it was enough to start with. The blizzard hit somewhere around midnight. Wes heard it coming before it arrived, the way you always do out here if you've lived in the mountains long enough. First, the wind picked up from the northwest, low and steady, moving through the pines with a sound like something breathing. Then the temperature dropped another 10 degrees in what felt like minutes. Then the snow came sideways and hard, driving against the cabin walls, piling against the door, turning the world outside the windows into a solid white nothing. By morning, they weren't going anywhere. The broken spur cabin was built from lodgepole pine, thick-walled and low-roofed, the kind of structure that had been put together with survival in mind and aesthetics dead last. One main room, a small sleeping loft above it, a cooking hearth along the north wall wide enough to stand in. The floor was rough-hewn plank. The single window on the east side had real glass in it, which Wes considered a luxury. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wooden chest, and a set of shelves along the west wall holding canned goods, ammunition, and a row of leather-bound ledger books standing upright between a horseshoe and a broken compass. It wasn't much. He knew it wasn't much. He'd brought her in the night before, just as the first real gusts hit, helped unhitch the horses, gotten them into the lean-to barn with feed and a cursory check of their legs, and then pushed through the wind back to the cabin with her close behind him. Dakota had gone to his own bunk in the small outbuilding he'd claimed as his quarters the previous spring. Wes had lit the hearth and shown Cassidy the loft, told her there were blankets in the chest, and that the loft held heat better than the main room, and then he'd sat down at the table and opened his ledger book and left her to it. He didn't hover. He didn't explain himself. He figured she'd had enough men making decisions about her space and her comfort for one day. He heard her on the ladder for a while, moving around up there, then silence. He worked the ledger until his eyes gave out, banked the fire, rolled himself in his blanket near the hearth, and slept on the floor. That was how the first night went. The second morning was the one that mattered. He woke before dawn, same as always, and stoked the fire and put water on for coffee, and went outside into the blizzard long enough to check on the horses and break the ice in their water trough and come back in so cold his fingers wouldn't bend properly for a few minutes. When he came back in stamping snow off his boots, she was already awake. She was sitting in the far corner of the main room, on the floor, with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up slightly and the blanket from the loft pulled around her shoulders. She'd been there long enough that she was clearly comfortable in that position, which meant she'd been there for a while. She was watching him. There was something in her right hand, thin and metal. He looked closer. An iron fork. One of his kitchen forks, pulled from the crock on the shelf. She was holding it loosely, not brandishing it, just holding it, the tines pointed away from her, resting against her knee. He looked at the fork. He looked at her. He crossed to the hearth without a word, poured himself a cup of coffee, and then poured a second one. He set the second cup on the floor several feet in front of her, and then walked back to the table and sat down. She watched all of this. After a moment, she reached out, took the cup, and wrapped both hands around it. He opened his ledger. He didn't look at her again right away. Outside, the blizzard continued its business. The wind found every gap in the log, chinking and pushed cold fingers through. The fire worked hard and held its ground. The cabin was dim and close and smelled of pine smoke and coffee and the faint cedar smell of the blanket she'd carried down from the loft. He gave it about 20 minutes. Then he set the ledger aside and stood up. He moved, slowly and deliberately, the way you move around a frightened animal. Not slow enough to be theatrical about it, but with intention. He crossed to the sleeping loft ladder, climbed halfway up and retrieved something from the shelf beside the loft entrance, came back down, crossed the room, and set it on the floor next to the wall, about 2 feet from where she sat. It was his spare revolver, a short-barreled Remington in a worn leather holster. He crouched down and took it out of the holster, showed her the cylinder, showed her it was empty. Every chamber, he tilted it so the light from the fire caught the empty brass. Then he set it on the floor in front of her, handle toward her, and stood back up. She stared at it. He said, "You can't fire it. There's no ammunition in it, but it's yours to hold if it makes you feel steadier." He paused. Sometimes just the weight of a thing helps. She looked from the revolver up to him. He went back to the table. He heard the small sound of her picking it up. He didn't look. It was another hour before she moved to the table. She came slow, circling wide around him to reach the second chair, keeping the table between them as she sat. She still had the fork, he noticed. It was tucked into the pocket of his coat, which she'd apparently kept on through the night. She set the empty revolver on the table between them. Then she reached inside the coat and produced a small leather notepad, brown, worn, the size of a playing card, with a short pencil tucked through the binding. She set it on the table. He glanced at it, looked back at his ledger. She opened the notepad and wrote something and slid it across to him. He looked down at it. "Why did you buy me?" He leaned back in his chair. Outside, a gust hit the cabin hard enough to shutter the window pane. The fire popped and sent a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. He thought about several different answers. He thought about the ones that would sound reasonable and clean and easy, the kind of answer you give when you want someone to feel settled. Then he decided she'd probably had enough of being managed and settled, and she deserved something true instead. He reached up and pulled aside the collar of his union suit, exposing his left shoulder. There was a scar there, long and ragged, running from just below the collarbone out toward the arm. It had healed badly. The skin there thickened and pale against the surrounding tan. "Sharpshooter," he said. "Autumn of '64, Virginia." He let go of the collar. "I was pinned down in a drainage ditch for about 6 hours. 2 men I'd been scouting with were already dead. The shooter was patient. Every time I moved, he'd fire." He picked up his coffee cup. "I wasn't afraid of dying. I'd made my peace with dying about 2 years before that." He drank. "Set it down. I was afraid of being trapped, of being reduced to something that just reacted to whatever someone else decided to do to me." He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "You were standing on those crates and you were terrified, and you were refusing to show it, and I recognized that. I know what it costs." She had the notepad in her lap. She was looking at him. He said, "That's the honest answer you asked." She looked down and wrote something, pushed it across. "You sleep on the floor of your own home?" It wasn't a question exactly. He read it twice. "It's your room now," he said. "My floor is fine. I've slept on worse." He paused. "I slept in a ditch in Virginia for 6 hours. The floor is considerably better." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. She wrote again. "How long is the storm?" "Day or two," he said. "Maybe 3. It's early in the season for one like this, but the mountains don't pay much attention to the calendar." He tilted his head toward the window, where the gray-white nothing continued to press against the glass. "Dakota will be fine. He's weathered worse, and he's got enough wood and food in his quarters to last a week." She nodded. She looked at the ledger book he'd been working in. Her eyes moved across the open page, tracking columns of figures, crop tallies, feed costs, the note in the margin where he'd calculated what he'd need to clear on the cattle drive to cover the bank payment in December. She looked for about 10 seconds and then looked away. He noticed. He didn't say anything yet. He spent the rest of the morning doing what needed doing inside. Cleaned and oiled his saddle, repaired a broken bridle strap, restacked the firewood he'd brought in from the lean-to. She stayed at the table most of that time. She'd found a mending kit in the wooden chest and had pulled out a pair of his wool socks with a hole in the heel and was darning them without being asked, with the concentrated attention of someone who needs to keep her hands occupied. He didn't tell her she didn't have to. He figured she knew that. Around noon, he heated up salt pork and the last of the biscuits from 2 days ago, and they ate at the table across from each other, the empty revolver still sitting between them. She ate carefully, the way people eat when they're very hungry, but don't want to appear very hungry. He pretended not to notice, and pushed the salt pork skillet closer to her side of the table when he topped off his own plate. After they'd eaten and the dishes were cleared, she picked up the notepad again. "Can I look at your ledger books?" He looked at her. Then he looked at the row of ledger books on the shelf. "Which ones?" She pointed at the shelf. "All of them, apparently." He thought about that for a second. They weren't private, exactly. They were just ranch records. Feed tallies, land surveys, the original property deed, 5 years of income and expense figures that painted a fairly complete picture of a ranch that was slowly losing ground to circumstances that were only partly bad luck and partly something worse. He stood up and carried all 6 ledgers to the table and stacked them in front of her. She opened the most recent one. She went to the survey section, where he'd glued in the land boundary maps, the original government survey documentation from when he'd filed on the property in 1873. She studied those pages for a long time. Then she went to the deed, then the mortgage documents, then the income tallies. He watched her read. She wasn't skimming. She was reading the way someone reads when they already understand the underlying structure of what they're looking at, moving through it faster in the places where the information was straightforward and slowing down at the places where it was complicated or where something didn't add up cleanly. She stopped at a page near the back of the 4th ledger, the one covering the past year. She looked at it for a while. Then she wrote on her notepad and pushed it across. "Your eastern boundary, the survey marker on the creek bend. Has anyone moved it?" He went still. He looked at what she'd written. He looked at her. "Why do you ask that?" She turned to the survey map, found the relevant page, and pointed to the creek bend on the eastern property line. Then she pointed to the expense entry from 8 months ago, where he'd paid a filing fee to the county land office to contest an overlap claim from a neighboring parcel. This filing, the overlap they claimed, it puts 300 acres of your best creek pasture in question. But the original survey places the marker 12 feet east of where the overlap claim says it is. He stood up and came around the table to look at the survey map from her side. She shifted the book so he could see clearly. She pointed to specific notations in the original survey text, the surveyor's reference marks, the creek bend description, the chain measurements. She was right. He'd looked at those documents before several times. He'd looked at them with a lawyer in Oak Haven who'd charged him $40 and told him the overlap claim was complicated. That lawyer had not caught what she caught in 40 minutes with a ledger book. He straightened up. He said, "Where did you learn to read a land survey?" She wrote, "My father was an attorney. Boundary disputes were part of his practice. He taught me to read survey documents when I was 12. A pause. Then below, he believed women should understand the law. He said, ignorance was a luxury that people without power couldn't afford." Wes read that last line twice. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table, which was the first time he'd voluntarily sat that close, and looked at the survey map again. "Show me," he said. She did. Over the next hour, she walked him through the documentation with the notepad, writing explanations and pointing to specific figures, building an argument as systematic and clear as any he'd seen a lawyer make in a courtroom. The overlap claim was either an honest error by an incompetent surveyor, or it was deliberate. She seemed to believe it was deliberate. She wrote the word deliberate and underlined it once, then looked at him. He believed it too. He'd believed it for a while. He just hadn't had the documentation arranged clearly enough to prove it. By late afternoon, the fire had burned down, and he built it back up, and she helped him bring in more wood from the lean-to, which involved opening the door into a wall of wind and driving snow and passing logs hand to hand as fast as possible before they both got soaked through. She laughed, or almost laughed. It was a soundless thing, her shoulders moving, her face doing something that was unmistakably amusement at the sheer absurdity of the situation. It made her look younger and entirely different from the hollowed-out woman who'd stood on those saloon crates the day before. He found himself almost smiling again. Almost. Evening came early, the way it does in October in the mountains, the white outside the window going gray and then dark. He made a proper supper this time, beans and salt beef and cornbread from a mix he'd been saving, and they ate again at the table. He lit the oil lamp. The cabin felt smaller in lamplight, warmer. The shadows pushed back to the corners, where they mostly stayed put. She was quieter after supper. Not tense, just tired. She had the notepad in front of her, but she wasn't writing. She was looking at the fire. He was looking at her, not in the way she'd probably been looked at in that saloon, just honestly observing her. She'd been through something that had taken her voice. Not a physical injury. He didn't think. It was the kind of mutism that comes from a shock so severe the mind closes that particular door and latches it from the inside. He'd seen it in men after certain battles. Two of the scouts he'd served with had gone like that after Chickamauga. One of them had never spoken again. The other had woken up one morning about 6 weeks later and talked all day as if he was making up for lost time. Whatever had happened to Cassidy Vance, it was in that territory. He didn't ask. Not yet. She picked up the notepad. Your ranch is losing money. I know, he said. The cattle drive in November. If the prices hold, you'll clear enough for the December payment. But not the February one, I know that too. The overlap claim on the eastern boundary is suppressing your credit. The bank considers that land in dispute until it's resolved, so they won't extend on it. He looked at her. You got all that from 6 ledger books, she wrote, and 5 years of payment records, and the county filing receipt, and a mortgage document with a clause your lawyer apparently didn't explain to you. She paused. Added, the clause in question allows the bank to accelerate the full loan balance if any portion of the secured property is under a competing claim for more than 12 months. He leaned forward. Say that again. She wrote it again, slower this time, and pointed to the specific paragraph in the mortgage document, which she'd apparently found, read, and understood while he was repairing the bridle strap that morning. He read the paragraph 3 times. 12 months. The overlap claim had been filed 8 months ago. He had 4 months to resolve a boundary dispute that a $40 lawyer had called complicated. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. How much do you actually know about land law? She considered this. Wrote, my father litigated 9 boundary cases in Illinois and Indiana. I attended every trial I was allowed into. I read his case files from the time I was 15. She stopped. Then I know enough. He thought about that for a while. The fire talked to itself in the hearth. The storm pressed against the walls, slightly less furious than it had been that morning. Still persistent, he said. I'm going to need to think about some things. She nodded. She closed the ledger books and stacked them neatly and pushed them back to his side of the table. She picked up the empty revolver. She stood up. She walked to the ladder and started climbing up to the loft. The revolver tucked under her arm, his coat still around her shoulders. At the top of the ladder, she paused. She looked back down at him. She held up the notepad. She'd written something on it before she stood up, and she was showing it to him now, tilting it toward the lamplight so he could read it from across the room. Thank you for the coat, and the coffee, and the floor. He read it. Looked up at her. She was already gone, over the edge of the loft, moving quietly across the boards above his head. He looked at the ledger books, stacked neatly on the table. At the survey map still open to the creek bend page. At the mortgage document she'd flagged with a strip of paper torn from her notepad. He'd hired her to cook and mend. She'd found a legal time bomb in his own paperwork in under 24 hours. He stoked the fire. He rolled out his blanket on the floor. Outside, the blizzard ran out of some of its fury and settled into a steady, determined snowfall that would cover everything by morning and make the world look clean and new, the way snow always did out here, the way it made it easy to believe that things could be built fresh from whatever was underneath. He lay on his back on the floor of his own cabin and stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the wind come down off the Bear Paw Peaks and push against the walls. 4 months. He had 4 months a failing herd, a corrupt land claim, and a mute woman in his loft who read legal documents the way other people read novels and held an iron fork in her pocket like it was the most natural thing in the world. He closed his eyes. It wasn't nothing. It was something. He just hadn't figured out yet exactly what. The blizzard spent itself out by the third day and left behind a world that was white and silent and brutally cold. Dakota came out of his quarters that morning, looking no worse for it, brushing snow off his shoulders with the patient efficiency of a man who had survived far worse weather than this and expected to survive considerably more. He was Lakota, 30 years old, with a broad, angular face and dark eyes that moved across a landscape the way a hawk's eyes move, always reading, always counting. He'd come to the Broken Spur 2 years ago, following a recommendation from a cavalry officer Wes had served with, and he'd stayed because the work was honest, and Wes had the sense to recognize skill when he saw it, regardless of where it came from. He'd already heard about the woman. Small towns talked fast, and even the 12 miles between the ranch and Oakhaven wasn't enough distance to slow a piece of news like that down. He didn't say much about it. He looked at Cassidy once, direct and assessing, the same way he looked at a horse he was evaluating. She looked back at him with equal directness. He seemed satisfied with whatever he saw and moved on to the question of the cattle, which was the more pressing issue anyway. The cattle had a problem. Wes had noticed it before the blizzard, had hoped the cold would slow whatever it was, had been wrong. By the morning the snow cleared. 3 of the 60 head were already lame, and when Dakota pulled up the hooves of the worst affected animal, what they found wasn't good. The tissue between the hooves was inflamed and cracked, seeping angry red at the edges. It smelled of rot. Dakota stood up from his crouch and looked at Wes. "Hoof, rot," he said. "The wet ground from the early rains. Then the freeze on top of it." He looked at the rest of the herd, moving restlessly in the far corral. "Could spread fast." Wes said, "How many do you think are already showing it?" "Hard to say until we check them all. Could be 6, could be 15. Dakota paused. "Could be more." Wes took his hat off, ran a hand through his hair, and put his hat back on. 15 animals out of 60 meant a quarter of his drive herd. Even if they recovered, they might not be trail fit by November. And if it spread further, the whole drive was at risk, which meant the December payment was at risk, which meant everything downstream of that was at risk. He was standing there, working through the numbers, when he heard boots on the corral fence. He turned around. Cassidy Vance had climbed the fence and was sitting on the top rail, watching the sick animal with the same focused attention she'd given his ledger books 3 days ago. She'd found a pair of old boots somewhere. His old ones from before, he'd bought a better pair, 2 sizes too large and stuffed with extra wool socks to make them fit. She was wearing her own dress with a wool blanket pinned around her shoulders against the cold. Wes said, "You don't need to be out here." She looked at him. She pulled out her notepad. "What is wrong with them?" "Hoof, rot. Bacterial infection in the tissue. It'll spread through the herd if we can't get it under control." She wrote, "What do you treat it with?" "Copper sulfate solution if we had it." "Pine tar. There's a livestock supply in Oakhaven, but the road won't be passable until tomorrow at the earliest." She looked at the sick animal again. She looked at the tree line beyond the corral, the dense stand of pine, and something else, birch maybe, along the lower slope of the hill to the east. She was quiet for a moment, working something out. She wrote, "Dakota, does he know the plants on this land?" Wes looked at her. "Why?" She wrote more, longer this time, and handed the notepad down to him. "My mother kept a medicinal garden in Chicago. She learned plant medicine from her own mother, who grew up in rural Kentucky. I helped her for years. There are plants that can treat bacterial infections in livestock. White pine bark has tannins that draw infection. Yarrow reduces inflammation. If there is wild garlic on this slope, it has strong antibacterial properties. These are not substitutes for copper sulfate, but they can hold the infection and slow the spread until you can get proper supplies." He read it twice. He looked up at her. She was watching him with a patient expression, the notepad in her lap, waiting for him to finish being surprised. He called over to Dakota, who was crouching by the sick animal's rear leg again. Dakota, do we have yarrow on the east slope? Dakota stood up. He looked at the east slope thoughtfully. Yes, and pine. Wild onion lower down near the creek. He paused. Why? She thinks we can make a poultice. Slow the spread until we get copper sulfate from town. Dakota came over to the fence. He looked at Cassidy. She showed him the notepad. He read it, lips moving slightly, then looked up at her with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something more like respect. He said, the yarrow will still be standing above the snow line on the east face. Pine bark we can take from the lower branches. The wild onion near the creek. I know where it grows, he thought for another moment. My grandmother used a similar treatment for horses. Different plants, but the same idea. Cassidy wrote something and showed it to him directly. What did she add that I haven't listed? Dakota looked at the notepad for a moment. Juniper berries. Crushed. She said it drew the heat out of infected tissue. He paused. There is a juniper stand at the top of the east slope. She nodded firmly. Wrote. Then we start there. They spent the next 2 hours on the east slope in cold that made every breath visible and every exposed finger ache. Dakota moved through the snow with easy confidence, finding the yarrow stalks above the snow line, dry and brittle but intact, stripping lower pine branches for the bark with a small hand axe. Cassidy moved alongside him, learning quickly which plants he was targeting, helping bundle and carry. Wes was checking fence line on the south pasture. When he came back and found them in the kitchen, they'd taken over his kitchen entirely. The table was covered with plant material, sorted into piles. A large pot of water was heating on the stove. Cassidy was crushing dried yarrow between 2 flat stones, methodical and focused, flour and plant debris on her sleeves. Dakota was peeling pine bark over a wooden bowl, narrating something quietly to her, and she was nodding as she worked. Wes stood in the doorway for a moment. He took off his coat. He hung it up. He went to the stove and looked in the pot. Tell me what to do, he said. Dakota said, stir. And don't let it boil too hard. It should simmer. He pointed to the yarrow pile. Add that when I say. They worked together through the midday hours, rendering the plants down into a thick, dark, strong-smelling mixture that Dakota said his grandmother had called drawing medicine, and that Cassidy wrote in her notepad was essentially a high-tannin antimicrobial compress. Between the two of them, they had the same knowledge approached from 2 completely different directions. And watching them work out, the overlap was something Wes found unexpectedly interesting. When the mixture had cooled enough to handle, they went back to the corral. Applying the poultice was not pleasant work. The cattle were sick and frightened, and a sick, frightened 1,200-pound animal is not a cooperative patient. It took all 3 of them, Dakota controlling the animal's head, Wes holding the flank and keeping the legs still, and Cassidy kneeling in the mud below the hooves to apply the poultice and wrap the binding strips. The mud was deep from snowmelt, and it was cold, and it smelled terrible. Cassidy did not appear to notice or care. After the 4th animal, Wes said, you should go back inside. We can finish this. She was kneeling in 6 inches of mud, with her blanket soaked through and her hair coming down from its pins. She looked up at him. She pulled out the notepad from her coat pocket, which was now also muddy. She wrote, I am not porcelain. I have a right to work for this land, alongside you. He looked at what she'd written. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. He stood there for a second in the cold mud of the corral, with the smell of sick cattle around him and a December deadline pressing on his chest. And he thought about what she'd written. She wasn't wrong. She'd come to this ranch as hired help. This was the help that was needed. She had skills directly relevant to what was in front of them right now. He'd been about to ask her to go inside and let the men handle it, and the only honest reason he could give for that was habit, an assumption he'd absorbed somewhere without examining it. He said, you're right. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to applying the poultice. He crouched down on the other side of the hoof and held the legs steady. They worked through the entire herd that afternoon, 60 animals, checking every hoof, treating the infected ones, cleaning and drying the hooves of the healthy ones to slow any spread. When it was finally done, they'd found 11 animals with visible infection. 3 were severe, 8 were early stage, and would respond well to treatment if they kept at it daily. 11 out of 60, better than Wes had feared. Still bad enough. They were washing up at the pump outside the barn. In the early dark, the cold water making hands hurt when Judge Sterling's men arrived. There were 2 of them, riding matching bay horses that were too well fed and too clean for working ranch animals. They wore long coats and had the slightly bored, slightly aggressive posture of men who do their employers intimidating for a living. The one in front had a wide blonde mustache and pale eyes and introduced himself as Harlan Briggs. "You Gage?" he said. West dried his hands on a rag. "You're trespassing." Briggs smiled. "Now that's not a hospitable greeting. We've ridden 12 miles in the cold to bring you a very generous offer." He reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. "Judge Sterling has authorized us to present a formal purchase proposal for the Broken Spur. Full property, stock included." He held the envelope out. "Given your current financial situation, the judge feels this is fair. You can tell Judge Sterling," West said, "that the Broken Spur is not for sale. Mr. Gage, I think if you look at the numbers, I know the numbers." Wes hadn't moved. His voice had that same fly it always had when he was past the point of casual conversation. "I also know that the overlap claim on my eastern boundary was filed 8 months ago by a surveyor who works for Sterling's land company. I know the survey measurements in that claim don't match the original government documentation by 12 feet at the Creek Bend marker." He paused. "I've had time to look into things." Briggs's smile had gone a degree or two cooler. "That's a matter still before the county land office." "It is," Wes agreed. "And until it's resolved in a proper proceeding with a proper surveyor present, Judge Sterling can keep his envelope." He looked at Briggs steadily. "Get off my land." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Dakota, who was standing a few feet back and to the left with his arms crossed and his expression entirely calm. He looked at Cassidy, who was still at the pump, watching him with those dark, steady eyes. He tucked the envelope back inside his coat. "The judge is a patient man," Briggs said. He turned his horse, and the 2 of them rode back down the trail toward the main road at an easy walk, not hurrying. Making sure to look like leaving was their own idea. Wes watched them go until they were past the tree line. Dakota came up beside him. He said, "They'll be back." "Yes," Wes said. "Sterling doesn't offer twice." "No," Wes said. "He doesn't." They both stood there for a moment in the cold. The night was coming down clear and very dark, the stars beginning to show above the peaks, the temperature already dropping toward what was going to be a hard freeze. Cassidy had come up on Wes's other side. She was holding her notepad. She wrote and held it up for both of them to see. "He used the overlap claim to suppress the credit. He'll use the accelerator clause in the mortgage if the claim isn't resolved. He wants you out legally, so he doesn't have to take you out any other way." Wes read it. "Dakota read it," Dakota said. "She's right," Wes said. "I know she's right." He looked at the trail where Sterling's men had disappeared into the dark. He thought about a corrupt magistrate with enough money to buy lawyers and surveyors and men like Briggs. He thought about a mortgage with a clause his own $40 lawyer had apparently missed. He thought about 60 cattle and 11 of them lame and a bank payment in December and another in February. He thought about the fact that he was standing here with a Lakota ranch hand and a mute woman from Chicago, and between the 3 of them they had plant medicine, legal knowledge, and about 40 years of accumulated stubbornness. He'd faced worse odds. Not by much, but some, he said. "Tomorrow we go to Oakhaven for copper sulfate and supplies. While we're there, I need to get into the land office and look at the survey filing." He looked at Cassidy. "I'd like you to come. If you're willing," she wrote. "I'm willing." "Good." He looked at both of them. "Tonight we eat something hot and we sleep, because tomorrow is going to be a long day." Dakota said, "I'll check the poultice bindings before bed." Wes nodded. They went inside. Dinner that night was a quieter thing than it might have been. The storm was gone, and the crisis was still here. and Sterling's men had reminded all three of them that there was a shape to what they were facing, that it wasn't just bad luck and bad weather, but something with intention behind it. That made it more serious, and also, paradoxically, more manageable. Bad luck is hard to fight. An enemy can be outmaneuvered. Cassidy ate with more appetite than she had the first 2 days. Her color was better too, Wes noticed. The hollowness in her cheeks was still there, but less severe. 3 days of regular meals and hard work had done something for her that he didn't have a word for exactly. After dinner, she spread the ledger books on the table again. She worked by lamplight for 2 hours, making notes in her notepad, building what looked like a systematic argument on paper. Wes sat across from her reading a week-old newspaper someone had left at the livery, and occasionally glancing at what she was doing. At one point, he looked over and saw that she'd reconstructed the entire survey discrepancy on a piece of blank paper, using his ruler and pencil, drawing the creek bend from both the original survey measurements and the overlap claim measurements, and marking the 12-foot difference in red ink she'd found somewhere in the desk drawer. He looked at the drawing for a moment. He said, "That's what you'd need to show in a land office proceeding." She nodded, he said. "Can you make 2 copies of that? One for the land office, one to keep." She was already pulling a second blank page toward her. He went back to his newspaper. Outside, the night was cold and still and enormous. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars. The cattle were quiet in the corrals, the treated hooves wrapped in their poultice bindings, the herd settling into sleep. Dakota had checked them all and come in briefly to say the 3 worst animals were already showing less swelling and gone back to his quarters. Small progress, incremental and unglamorous and real. Wes folded the newspaper. He looked at the woman across the table from him, bent over her careful drawings in the lamplight, her dark hair loose now around her shoulders, the iron fork still in her coat pocket, the empty revolver at her elbow on the table. She'd walked out into the mud that afternoon without being asked. She'd knelt in it beside him and done the work without complaint and without drama. She'd written those 6 words on the notepad and handed them to him with complete steadiness. "I am not porcelain. I have a right." He'd hired her to cook and keep books. She'd saved 11 cattle, identified a legal trap in his mortgage, and told him something true about his own assumptions without raising her voice or shedding a tear about any of it. He thought about the look on Briggs's face when Wes had cited the 12-foot survey discrepancy, the fractional hesitation before the man had recovered his composure. That hesitation was worth something. It meant they hadn't expected it. It meant they'd assumed Wes was just a rancher with a ledger he couldn't fully read and a lawyer he'd already outspent. They'd assumed wrong. He banked the fire for the night. He rolled out his blanket on the floor. She climbed the ladder to the loft, drawings tucked under her arm. At the top, she paused. Same as the first night. She held the notepad over the edge. He squinted at it from across the room. "The cattle will recover. The infected ones. The treatment will hold until you get the copper sulfate." He looked at it. Then he looked up at her. "How do you know?" She wrote one more line and held it up. "Because my mother's medicine always worked." Then she was gone into the loft, and he was looking at the dark ceiling again, the fire dying down behind him, and the stars outside, and the quiet, vast Montana night pressing in from all directions. The cattle would recover. The land survey could be challenged. 4 months was 4 months. Long enough if you moved right. He closed his eyes. The rain came in hard from the west, and it didn't announce itself with a drizzle or a warning. It arrived all at once, flat and gray and relentless, drumming against the cabin roof and turning the yard outside into a soupy mess of mud and dead grass. The mountains disappeared behind it. Even the tree line on the east slope went blurry and vague, just a dark smear where the pines used to be. It had been 3 days since they'd gone into Oakhaven. 3 days since Wes had watched Cassidy lay her hand-drawn survey diagram across the land office counter and wait while the clerk's expression shifted from bored irritation to something more careful. The clerk had taken the documents. He'd promised to review them. He hadn't promised anything else. The cattle were improving. The copper sulfate had done what the poultice had started. Two of the three worst animals were already putting weight on their treated hooves. The herd wasn't whole yet, but it was moving in the right direction. Cassidy was at the table when Wes came in from the morning's first fence walk, soaked to the elbows, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. She had her notepad open, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at something else. A small leather satchel sat on the table in front of her, old and worn, the brass clasp green with age. He hadn't seen it before. He pulled off his coat. He hung it near the fire. He poured coffee. He sat down across from her, and something in her face told him today was different. She opened the satchel and took out a bundle of papers, folded and refolded. Many times the creases worn soft. She unfolded them carefully and laid them flat between them. They were newspaper clippings, Chicago Tribune mostly, and one from the Illinois Journal. The headlines were old, more than a year back. Arthur Vance, attorney, killed by unknown assailants outside his office on LaSalle Street on a Tuesday evening in March 1877. The papers called it a robbery. They noted that Mr. Vance had been preparing litigation on behalf of several clients with land claims in the Montana and Dakota territories. Cases involving a network of fraudulent survey filings connected to interests that preferred to remain unnamed. Wes read the last clipping twice. He set it down. He looked at her. She had the notepad already in her hand. She wrote and slid it across. My father spent 4 years investigating land fraud in the Western Territories. He had documentation connecting corrupt magistrates and land companies to fraudulent survey filings, forged deeds, and the intimidation of homesteaders. He was preparing to take it to a federal court. She turned the page and kept writing. He told me 2 weeks before he died that someone was following him. I told him he was being dramatic. A pause. Then below that, he was not being dramatic. Wes said nothing. He waited. She turned another page. The night they killed him, I was supposed to meet him for dinner. I arrived at his office early. I saw 2 men leaving through the window at the end of the hall. My father was on the floor. She stopped writing for a moment. Her hand wasn't quite steady when she started again. I ran. I went back to our rooms, took his case files, took everything I could carry, and left Chicago that night. I have been moving since then. Vance is my real name, but the people I traveled west with knew me as Claire Hollins. He looked up from the notepad. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He said, "They killed your father to stop a federal case." She nodded. He said, "And you have his files." She reached into the satchel and took out a second bundle, thicker than the first, tied with string. She set it on the table, but didn't open it, he said. "Do you know who gave the order?" She opened the notepad to a fresh page. She wrote one name and turned it to face him. He read it. He sat there for a long moment with the rain coming down and the fire behind him. Then he said, "Sterling." She nodded once. He looked at the file bundle. He looked at the rain hammering the window. Outside, the south fence line had been pulling at the back of his mind all morning. He'd seen a post leaning wrong at first light, the ground softened by the rain and the footing gone loose. If it went over in this weather, he'd lose the section. He stood up. He said, "I have to go fix a fence line before that post goes down. An hour, maybe 2. He looked at her directly. "You stay inside. Lock the door bar." He paused. "I mean that," she wrote quickly. "You know about the bar? I put it there last winter after we had trouble with a mountain lion. It'll hold." He pulled his coat back on, still wet. "Lock it after me." She nodded. He went out into the rain. She sat at the table for a while, after the hooves faded into the mud. The rain drummed and rattled, and made the cabin feel smaller and more solid at the same time. She went to the door and dropped the heavy bar across it. She went back to the table. She was reading through her father's case files when she heard it. Not the rain, not the wind. Something underneath the rain at the back wall of the cabin. A scraping. The small, careful sound of a man trying very hard not to make any sound at all. She went completely still. The back wall had no window. It had one thing the front wall didn't. The gap behind the stacked firewood where Wes had never added a second layer of chinking. She'd noticed it the first day, the thin stream of cold air coming through near the floor. A gap that, with an old cabin and a determined effort, could be widened just enough. She was already moving. She didn't run. Running makes noise, and noise tells a man where you are. She moved fast and quiet, and grabbed two things from the shelf above the hearth, the small hand axe Wes used for splitting kindling, and the oil lamp, full from that morning. She moved to the kitchen side of the cabin, the corner beside the stove, where she could see both the back wall and the front door at the same time. The scraping came again. Then a creak. Then the slow, deliberate sound of someone working at something that needed working at. She thought about the iron fork in the coat pocket by the door. Too far now. She thought about the empty Remington, still useless except as a bluff, and the man coming through that wall had likely stopped being bluffable a long time ago. She thought about the lamp. Kerosene burns hot and fast and spreads in whatever direction it's thrown. The kitchen had a stone floor, unlike the main room's wood planks. Stone didn't catch. But a man soaked in kerosene with a lamp thrown in his direction was a very different problem than a man who simply walked into a room. She didn't want to burn the cabin down. She also didn't want to die. She set the lamp on the edge of the stove and unscrewed the base. She tilted it carefully and poured half the oil into the skillet sitting cold on the stovetop. She kept the other half in the lamp and held it in her left hand, the axe in her right. The sound at the back wall stopped. Then the wood cracked, low and sharp, and a section of the lower logs shifted inward. He came through feet first, dropping to the floor in a controlled crouch. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long, brown coat soaked through. He had a revolver in his right hand, and he stood up out of the crouch, smoothly, a man with no nerves left about this sort of work. He looked at the empty main room. He looked left toward the door. He hadn't looked right yet. She picked up the skillet. She threw the kerosene hard and direct, and it hit him across the chest and face in a wide, ugly wave. He spun toward her. He raised the gun. She threw the lamp, not lit. She threw it hard at the floor between them. The glass base shattered, and the oil from the base spread across the wooden planks between his feet and hers, in a dark, reeking puddle that neither of them was willing to step through with a live flame nearby. He stopped. So did she. They looked at each other across the oil-slicked floor. He was big. Close up, even bigger. He had a heavy jaw and pale, flat eyes, and his grip on the revolver wasn't shaking. This was a professional, and she understood that clearly and without flinching. He said, "Where are the files?" She said nothing, because she couldn't, and also because she wouldn't have if she could. He took one careful step toward her, picking his feet up over the oil slick, and she raised the hand axe. He stopped again. He looked at the axe, at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, recalculation. He'd come here expecting a mute woman alone in a cabin, and he was updating his assumptions in real time. That took him about 3 seconds too long. The door bar came off with a crack she heard from across the room. The door hit the wall. Wes came through it with his rifle already up. He read the room in 1 second. The broken back wall, the oil on the floor, the big man in the brown coat with his gun half-turned toward Cassidy. He didn't say a word. He moved. What followed was fast and brutal, and nothing like what people describe around campfires. Wes drove the rifle barrel into the man's gun hand as the revolver fired, the shot going wide into the ceiling, plaster dust raining down. Then they were in close, too close for the rifle, and it became something worse than a gunfight. It became a struggle on the floor of a small room with oil everywhere, and broken glass, and the fire in the hearth, throwing unpredictable shadows. The big man was strong, near enough to Wes to make no difference. He got a hand around Wes's throat, and they went down together, crashing into the table, ledger, books scattering. Wes drove his elbow into the man's side, once and again, and the grip loosened enough to break. Then the man got hold of the knife at his belt. Cassidy hit him with the flat of the hand axe across the back of his skull. Not a killing blow, aimed to interrupt. It did. The knife stroke meant, for Wes's ribs went shallow and wide, cutting through the shoulder of his coat and into the muscle beneath. and the man dropped from the partial second of impact before recovering and throwing himself sideways. Wes had his own knife out by then. He was bleeding from the shoulder, but his hand was steady, and the big man saw it and saw Wes's face above it. And in that face, there was nothing left to negotiate with. The man made a decision in the space of a breath. He made the wrong one. It ended on the floor of the Broken Spur cabin, in the kerosene smell and the rain, sound, and the firelight. When it was over, the quiet was enormous. Wes knelt on the floor, breathing hard, his hand pressed to his shoulder. Cassidy was already moving to him. She'd torn a strip from the hem of her underskirt before he'd even gotten to his feet and pressed it hard against the cut. He said, "I'm all right." She gave him a look that said she would make that determination herself. He winced. I said, "I'm all right." She pointed at the wound. She held the notepad with one hand while keeping pressure with the other and wrote one-handed. "You're not all right. You have a cut 4 inches long in your shoulder, and it needs to be closed," he said. "It's not as deep as it looks," she wrote. "That is what men always say." He almost laughed, then stopped because it hurt. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey from the shelf, which made him grip the table edge and say something brief and quiet under his breath. Then she closed it with strips of clean cloth tied tight. Her hands were steady the whole time. She didn't look away from the work. She simply did what needed doing. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him. He said, "The fire trap." Using the kerosene, he paused. That was smart. She wrote, "I didn't want to burn down the cabin, I noticed." She wrote, "I was also genuinely considering it." He nodded, slow. "I believe you." They both looked at the man on the floor, at the long brown coat. Wes crouched down with effort, his shoulder moving stiffly, and went through the coat pockets. Inside pocket first, he found a folded paper, heavy stock, the kind used for legal documents. He unfolded it. It was a land transfer deed. Formal language filled most of the page, the boilerplate of property transfer. The property described was the Broken Spur, all 60 acres, water rights included, transferring to a land company called Meridian Valley Holdings. He'd never heard of Meridian Valley Holdings. At the bottom, in the space where a signing authority would place their seal, was a circle of red wax. Pressed into it, clear and precise, was a letter S inside a small square frame, stylized, official. A seal a man has made for himself when he considers his own name worth stamping into things permanent. He knew whose seal it was. He'd seen it on the county land office's correspondence. He'd seen it on the overlap claim filing. He'd seen it on a document framed behind the desk in Sterling's courthouse chambers. Cassidy was beside him. She'd come around without him hearing her. She was looking at the seal. She took the deed from his hands, studied it, then went to the table and opened her father's file bundle. She worked the knot loose and spread the papers out. She moved through them the way someone moves through documents when they know precisely what they're looking for. She found it near the bottom of the stack. She held it up next to the deed. Another document, older, a different property in Illinois described in the same legal boilerplate. At the bottom, a red wax seal, the same letter S, the same square frame. Her father's handwriting was on the page beside it, small and neat. Seal matches deeds from 4 fraudulent Montana filings. Origin, territorial magistrate. Name not yet confirmed. Investigation ongoing. Dated 2 weeks before Arthur Vance was killed on LaSalle Street. The rain came down. The fire moved in the hearth. Somewhere in the far corral, one of the cattle made a low sound and went quiet again. Wes stood at the table and looked at the 2 documents side by side. He said quietly, "Sterling had your father killed." She didn't write anything. She didn't need to. She was looking at the documents with the expression of someone who has suspected a thing for a long time and is now holding the proof of it in both hands. It wasn't exactly grief. It was older than grief. It was someone who had been carrying a weight so long they'd almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. And the proof didn't make the weight lighter. It just made it real in a new and formal way. He picked up the deed to the Broken Spur. He turned it over. He looked at the red wax seal one more time. He said, "He sent this man to get your father's files and to take my land while he was at it. 2 birds." She reached for the notepad. She wrote, My father's documentation names specific magistrates. Sterling must know it exists. He's known since Chicago. She paused. Then he couldn't let the files reach a federal court. He still can't, Wes said, which means as long as you have those files, you're a target. She wrote, yes, and as long as you're between Sterling and this land, so are you. He looked at her steadily. She looked back at him with those dark, careful eyes, and there was nothing in them waiting to be rescued. She was laying out facts, letting him decide what to do with them, the same clarity she'd brought to every other problem since she'd walked through his door. Then we used the files. She tilted her head slightly. Waiting, he said. Sterling has gone to a great deal of trouble to keep your father's documentation out of federal hands. That means federal hands are exactly where it needs to go. He looked at the rain-gray window. I have a contact, a man named Calloway. He was with the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Benton during the cattle disputes in '75. He's straight. He paused. I think, she wrote. You think? I'd put it at strong probability. She considered this. Then she wrote. The cattle drive is in 3 weeks. Fort Benton is north of the pass. Yes, he said. She looked at her father's files spread on the table. She looked at the deed with Sterling's seal. Then she started gathering the papers back into order, her hands steady and deliberate. She tied the bundle back with the string. She picked up the broken spur deed and tucked it on top of everything. She held the whole bundle out to him. She wrote, keep this somewhere they won't find it if they send someone else. He took it. He met her eyes. He said, your father built this case so it could survive him. He knew what he was doing. She looked at him. Something moved briefly in her face before she brought it back under control. She wrote, he always said, the law was the most powerful weapon in a free country. She stopped, then added, he said the powerful feared it more than any gun. Wes looked at what she'd written for a long moment. He was right, he said. He put the documents in the waterproof oilskin pouch he kept for the property deed and pushed it to the bottom of the wooden chest, under the winter blankets, under everything. Outside, the rain kept falling. The mountains stayed hidden behind it. He looked at the broken logs on the back wall. He looked at the oil-dark floor, still reeking of kerosene. He said, I'll board the back wall tonight and clean the floor tomorrow. He looked at her. You all right? She thought about it for a moment. Then she wrote, with a steadiness that made him believe it entirely. I am not finished yet. He looked at that. He nodded. Once slow, neither was he. They left before first light. The cattle drove better in the cold, Dakota said, and he was right. 60 head moved more willingly through the brittle pre-dawn dark than they ever did in the slow heat of afternoon. The animals went in a loose column, steaming in the November air, their hooves packed and wrapped, and mostly healed, moving with the patient, plodding rhythm of cattle that have accepted they are going somewhere, whether they like it or not. Wes rode point on his bay gelding. Dakota worked the left flank on his paint. Cassidy rode behind, and to the right on a steady gray mare named Birch that Dakota had picked for her personally, saying only that Birch had good sense and a calm head. Both things had turned out to be true. She wore her own dress, layered under 2 of Wes's wool shirts and his heavy sheepskin coat, all of it belted at the waist with a length of leather strap, so nothing caught on the wind. She'd pulled her dark hair back tight and tucked it under a wide-brimmed hat that was 2 sizes too large. In the pre-dawn dark, she was mostly shadow and coat, and that hat moving steady alongside the herd. Wes had watched her mount up that morning, without assistance, check her own cinch, check Birch's hooves, and take her position before he'd even finished saddling the bay. He hadn't said anything. He'd noted it the way he noted everything, quietly, and moved on. The first day was straightforward. The trail north out of the Bear Paw foothills was wide and well-traveled, and the weather held gray but calm. They stopped once at midday to water the cattle at a creek crossing, and Cassidy rode ahead to check the ford depth without being asked. She came back and held up 5 fingers, and then lowered her hand to knee height. 5 inches, maybe safe. Dakota nodded his approval. Wes said, good, and they pushed the herd across. They camped at the edge of the timber that night, in a hollow sheltered enough from the wind to make a fire worth the trouble. Cassidy cooked salt pork and hardtack, and they ate without much conversation. Wes's shoulder was stiff from the cold, the cut from the week before, closed but still pulling, and he moved it carefully when he didn't think anyone was watching. Cassidy noticed but didn't write anything about it. After supper, she took out the notepad. She wrote something and passed it to Wes across the fire. "Tomorrow we hit the pass." He read it. He poured the last of the coffee into his cup. "Mid-morning," he said. "If we move early," she wrote, "Dakota is worried. Dakota worries professionally. It's why he's still alive." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote, "Are you worried?" He drank his coffee. He looked at the fire. "I'm thinking," he said. "There's a difference." She took the notepad back. She wrote one more thing and set it on the ground between them where the firelight could reach it. "Sterling knows we're making the drive. He had someone watching the ranch." He picked the notepad up. He read it twice. He set it down and looked at the dark timber around them, at the way the tree line swallowed everything past 50 yards. Then he looked at Dakota across the fire. Dakota said, without looking up from the blade he was sharpening, "She's right." "I know," Wes said. They were quiet for a while after that. Dakota banked the fire. Wes took first watch. Cassidy wrapped herself in her blanket near the warmth of the coals. She didn't sleep quickly. He could tell from her breathing, from the way she shifted once and then went deliberately still. But she didn't reach for the notepad. Whatever she was thinking, she was keeping it to herself tonight. He looked up at the clear black sky above the timber and thought about 12 feet, about a survey marker on a creek bend, about a red wax seal on a land deed, about a man in a Chicago office named Arthur Vance who'd spent 4 years building a case that was now tucked in an oilskin pouch inside his saddlebag. He thought about Fort Benton and a Marshal Calloway and whether strong probability was enough to stake everything on. He kept watch. The cattle settled. The night stayed quiet. Morning came fast and cold. Deadman's Pass earned its name the ordinary way, the way most places earn dark names in Montana, from a combination of geography and weather and the poor decisions of men who underestimated both. The trail through the pass ran along a limestone ledge, roughly 8 feet wide at its narrowest point, with the mountain wall rising steeply to the left and the canyon dropping away to the right. The drop was long. You couldn't see the bottom from the trail. The cattle didn't like it. They'd had some exposure to open terrain and trail work, but the pass was something different. The narrow ledge, the sound the wind made, funneling through the canyon walls, the way the rock changed underfoot from packed earth to bare stone. They slowed. They bunched. They needed constant pressure from the flanks to keep moving. Wes went first on foot, leading the bay and reading the trail. The footing was solid where it was sheltered, icy in the exposed sections, and there were 2 places he marked mentally as needing caution on the way through. He came back and told Dakota. They worked out how they'd handle the cattle through the tight section. By mid-morning, they were in the pass. It should have taken 40 minutes to move 60 head through the narrowest stretch. Dakota on the left, keeping the animals away from the wall and its bad footing. Cassidy on the right, keeping them off the edge, her horse steady and sure, despite the exposure. Wes up front, reading what was ahead, calling, back directions when the trail demanded it. The wind came up. It didn't come from the west like it usually did. It came through the canyon itself, funneled and sharp, driving a wall of fine snow with it that turned the air white and closed down visibility to 30 feet, then 20. The cattle reacted to it immediately, shifting and pressing, the animals in the middle pushing outward against Dakota and Cassidy from pure blind instinct. Cassidy pressed Birch hard into the right flank, keeping the pressure steady. She could feel Birch tensing beneath her, the mare's muscles tight and ready, but the horse held. She leaned low and kept her eyes on what she could see of the trail ahead. She almost didn't hear it over the wind. Almost. It was a short, sharp sound, different from anything the storm was making. Mechanical, deliberate. Then the ledge above them moved. The dynamite had been set high, in the cliff face on the upper left wall of the pass, positioned to send the rockfall outward and down across the trail in a sweeping arc. Whoever had placed it knew exactly what they were doing. The explosion was two blasts, fast together, boom boom, and the cliff face came apart in a rolling wave of rock and debris and loosened snow that hit the trail like a fist. The world came apart in noise and dust and the screaming of cattle. The herd panicked. All at once, 60 animals surging in every direction, colliding with each other, with the walls, pressing toward the edge in blind terror. Dakota's voice cut through the chaos, shouting, trying to turn the lead animals back. Cassidy yanked Birch hard to the right, away from the rockfall, keeping the mare from going down under the press of terrified animals. She couldn't see Wes. She stood in her stirrups and looked through the white-gray air and the dust, and she could not find him. Then a steer came through the fog at a dead run, shoulder high and panicking, and it hit the bay from behind. The bay screamed. She saw the horse go sideways, front legs scrambling at the edge of the trail, and then Wes was off the saddle, falling, one hand reaching for the saddle horn and not finding it, and both horse and rider went over the edge of the pass. The bay caught itself on a rock shelf 10 feet down, struggling, finding footing. Wes did stop. He hit the slope below the shelf and rolled, snow and rock, and the long, terrible fall of a man going down a place he cannot stop himself from going. A steer had gone over too, one of the panicked animals following the gap in the trail edge, and it came down the slope in a thrashing mass of terrified animal that hit Wes at the bottom and drove him into the snow and rock and went still. The snow came down white and solid and covered everything. Cassidy was off Birch before she'd finished thinking about it. She ran to the edge of the trail and looked down into the white fog below, and the slope was too steep, and the snow was too deep, and she couldn't see anything moving. From up above, from somewhere in the blinding storm on the cliff face, a rifle fired. Then another. The shots hit the rock face to her left and sent shards of stone peppering across the trail. Dakota hit her from behind, not hard but fast, wrapping one arm around her and pulling her back against the cliff wall into the shadow of a rock overhang. She fought him for a second, just a second. Then another shot came and took chips from the ledge where she'd been standing, and she stopped fighting. He pressed them both flat against the stone, breathing hard against her ear. He said, low and tight, "If they see you move, they'll shoot down into that ravine to make sure." She understood that. She understood it completely. She pressed her back against the cold stone and went absolutely still. The mercenaries were firing from above. She could hear them, 2 guns at minimum, positioned on the upper cliff face beyond the rockfall. They couldn't see clearly through the blizzard either. They were firing at movement, at anything that shifted in the white below, which meant Wes was alive, or had been alive, when they started firing down. The cattle were scattered. Some had made it through the pass ahead. Some had turned back. The trail between Cassidy and the slope where Wes had gone over was an open stretch with no cover, swept by wind, and now by rifle fire from above. 40 feet of completely exposed ledge. Dakota had his rifle. He looked upward at the cliff face, reading angles, calculating. She watched his face and could see him working through it. The problem was the whiteout. The mercenaries had elevation and cover. He had neither, not here. He looked at her. He said, "We pull back to the bend, get under cover. Then I can work the angle on the upper shelf." She looked at the exposed ledge. She looked at the slope below the trail edge, at the white, nothing that had swallowed Wes. Dakota said, "I can't pull him up if I'm dead, Cass." She knew he was right. She moved. They pulled back to the bend in the trail, where the cliff wall curved enough to give cover on 2 sides. Dakota immediately began working his way up the cliff face on their side, finding handholds in the rock, moving with a controlled economy that she watched with something close to disbelief. He was climbing in a blizzard up a cliff face with a rifle slung across his back, and he was moving, like it was just another piece of work to be done. She went back to the edge of the overhang and looked down the slope. The snow was still coming hard, and the visibility was worse than it had been 5 minutes ago. She could see the dark shape of the steer 20 feet down the slope, unmoving. She could see the scar of disturbed snow where something had come down through it. She looked for Wes. The steer was large, 5, 600 pounds at least, pinning whatever was under it. The snow around it was wrong, too disturbed, too dark at the edges where the rock underneath had broken the surface. She looked at that dark edge. She looked at it for a long moment in the white, screaming cold of Deadman's Pass, with rifle fire cracking somewhere above her, and the storm tearing at her coat, and the 40 feet of open trail between her and the slope. Above her, Dakota's rifle fired once, from somewhere high on the cliff face. One of the guns from above went silent. The other kept firing, more erratic now, moving, no longer certain of its target. She looked down at the dark stain, spreading slowly in the snow at the base of the slope. Something happened in her chest that she did not have a name for. It was bigger than fear and older than grief, and it moved through her like a current, like water that has been held behind something for too long, finding the crack at last. Every day in Chicago since March, every night on the road west. Every cold morning on this ranch where she'd woken up and decided again to keep going, to keep working, to keep being useful, to not think about what had been taken from her, because thinking about it meant feeling it, and feeling it meant stopping, and she could not stop. She could not stop then. She looked at the blood in the snow. She could not stop now. The thing that came out of her didn't sound like her voice. It didn't sound like anything she remembered having. It was raw and ragged, and it came from somewhere below her ribs, somewhere she hadn't opened in over a year, and it tore out of her like it had been waiting, with its hands pressed against the door the entire time. It cracked across the canyon like a second shot. It bounced off the walls and came back from the far cliff face and rolled away down into the white nothing below the pass. Wes! The mercenary above went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat. Then she heard movement on the cliff above, the remaining shooter turning toward the sound, finding her position. Dakota's rifle fired a second time from the high shelf. The movement above stopped. Cassidy was already moving. She was already at the edge of the trail. Looking down the slope, her hands finding the first rock, her body doing what her mind had already decided. The mercenaries were down or gone. Dakota was above her. Wes was below her in the snow and the blood, and she was going to get to him. She started down the slope. The rock was wet, and the snow was deep, and her boots were meant for a cabin floor, not a cliff face, but she went anyway, hand over hand, the cold eating through her gloves, her breath visible in sharp white clouds against the gray air. Behind her and above, the pass was silent except for the wind. Below her, the dark shape of the steer, and the darker shape beneath it, waited in the white. She didn't look back. The wind came through the canyon like something alive and angry, sweeping clean everything that wasn't stone, or anchored deep in the earth. Snow drove sideways off the cliff face. Visibility was down to maybe 20 feet, and even that felt generous. Cassidy pressed herself flat against the rock and breathed. Her voice was still in her throat. Not the absence that had been there for a year and a half. That familiar, hollow silence she'd learned to live inside. Something else now. Something raw and split open and terrifying in its newness. Her own voice had come out of her like something breaking free of a trap, and her throat ached with it, and her hands were shaking so hard she could barely keep her grip on the rock face. The mercenaries had gone quiet above. Dakota had seen to that, with 2 shots from the high shelf, precise and deliberate. The way everything Dakota did was precise and deliberate. She'd heard him working his way back down after the second shot. She'd also heard, from somewhere below the trail ledge, the particular silence that follows a very large something, coming to rest in deep snow. She didn't let herself think about what that silence meant. Not yet. She found the next handhold and went down. The cliff face below the trail wasn't a sheer drop. It was more of a broken slope. Ledged and irregular, the kind of terrain that was almost climbable in good weather and genuinely punishing in bad. There were places where the rock was glazed with ice, and her boots skated across it with no purchase at all. And she had to grip with her fingers and her forearms and press her whole body against the stone and move sideways until she found something solid. Her gloves were already wet through. She couldn't feel the tips of her fingers, and she stopped paying attention to that because it wasn't useful information right now. 20 feet down, then 30. The wind was worse here, funneling up through the canyon from below, and it hit her in gusts that tried to peel her off the rock face. She held on. She found the steer before she saw it. Her boot came down on something that wasn't stone and wasn't snow, and she looked, and there it was. The massive dark shape of the animal, half buried in the drift that had formed against a rock outcropping. It had come down the slope, and the slope had stopped it here. The steer was gone, had been gone since the fall. Wes was not visible. She stood on the outcropping beside the steer and looked. The snow around the animal was disturbed in a wide arc, churned and dark at the edges. Dark in the specific way that snow gets dark when what's melting into it isn't meltwater. She moved around the far side of the steer without stopping to think about what she might find. She decided before she came down this slope what she was doing, and changing her mind was not part of it. He was there. He was wedged between the steer and the rock outcropping, partly protected by the animal's bulk from the worst of the slope's impact. He was on his side, one arm under him, his hat gone somewhere up the mountain. His face was turned toward the rock. He wasn't moving. She dropped to her knees in the snow and put her hand against his neck. A pulse. She had to press hard to be sure, her own fingers too numb to feel much. But it was there, slow and thready and entirely real. She exhaled. It came out shaky. She pulled it back together. His right leg was wrong. She could see it without moving him. The angle of the thigh, where it disappeared under the steer, something off in a way that made her stomach clench. But the blood in the snow was coming from somewhere else. She found it when she got her hands under him to check his back. A wet, dark tear through the lower part of his coat on the left side, just above the hip. A bullet. One of the shots fired down from above had found him. She looked at the wound. She looked at his face. She looked at the gray sky above them and the slope stretching up to the trail where the pass waited in the blizzard. There was a cave. She'd seen it on the way down. A dark gap in the cliff face, maybe 15 feet to the east, low and wide. The kind of formation the mountains made sometimes when the rock fractured along old fault lines. She'd noticed it the way you notice things when you're climbing, and your brain is cataloging everything at once. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind and out of the snow, and right now those were the only things that mattered. She couldn't carry him. He was nearly a foot taller than her and outweighed her by better than 80 pounds. She couldn't carry him, and she couldn't leave him here. And so she did the third thing, which was drag him, slowly and carefully, and with every ounce of strength she had, using his coat collar and the belt of his gear, moving 1 foot at a time across the snow toward the cave opening. It took a long time. She didn't count the minutes. Counting would have made it worse. She got him inside. The cave was low-ceilinged and roughly oval, maybe 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The stone floor covered in a thin layer of wind-blown snow that had blown in from the opening, but was nothing like the open slope outside. It was cold. It was very cold. But the wind stopped at the opening, and the sound of the storm became something muffled and exterior instead of something she was standing inside of. She pulled him as far from the opening as the space allowed. She propped his upper body against the cave wall. She got her first clear look at his face. He was pale in a way she hadn't seen before. His lips had a grayish cast to them. His breathing was shallow but regular, and when she put her palm against his cheek, it was colder than it should have been, significantly colder. The particular coldness that meant his body was already pulling heat away from the surface and fighting to keep what was left somewhere deeper. Hypothermia, and a bullet wound, and a leg that might be fractured or might just be badly bruised, but she couldn't check properly until she could get some light and warmth into this cave, neither of which she had yet. She started with what she did have. Dakota carried a canvas pack on his saddle, the same pack every long-range rider carried, rolled and tied behind the cantle. She'd watched him tie it that morning. She did not know where Dakota's horse was. She did know that her own saddlebag, which she'd slung over her shoulder before coming down the cliff face, without consciously deciding to, was here. She opened it. She had dry matches in the tin she'd taken to carrying since the first week at the ranch. She had 2 strips of hard salt beef, a length of cord, and her father's oilskin document pouch tucked flat against the lining. She had her notepad. She had the small hand axe she'd tucked in before mounting up that morning, a habit she'd developed since the night the man had come through the cabin wall. She had the belt from her coat. She looked at these things, and then she looked at Wes, and she started working. The axe gave her wood. There was scrub brush wedged in a crack in the cave wall, dry enough, and a few pieces of deadfall had blown partway into the opening. Not much. Enough for a small fire if she was careful with it. She built it against the back wall where the rock would catch the heat and throw it back, and she lit it on the second match, and she fed it slowly, and said nothing because there was nothing to say and no one there to say it to. The fire took. It was small. It was warm. She went back to Wes. She got his coat off first, and the shirt underneath it. He stirred when she moved his shoulder, and his eyes opened halfway. Not focused, not registering her. She said quietly, "I've got you." Her voice still didn't sound like her voice. It was rough and low, like something that had been put away in a drawer for a long time and needed working back into shape. She said it anyway. The bullet had gone in above the left hip, and as far as she could tell from the blood and the angle of entry, had not gone through. That was bad, and also, in its way, practical, because an exit wound would have been worse out here. She used the cord and strips torn from his shirt to pack the wound as tightly as she could manage. It wasn't surgery. It was the best she could do, and she did it without flinching, because flinching was not useful. Then she covered him. Her coat went over him. She opened the saddlebag and found the thin canvas ground cover rolled at the bottom, the one Dakota had put in when he'd packed her bag that morning, because Dakota thought of things like that, and she covered Wes with that too. Then she did the math on what was left to work with and sat down beside him with her back against the cave wall and pulled the canvas edges around them both. It was not comfortable. It was not warm, not immediately. Her hands were still shaking, and her feet were entirely numb, and the fire was small, and the cave was still cold, and the storm outside was still making itself known in the low, constant moan of wind through the canyon. She sat close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and her body heat went into the canvas between them, and she felt his breathing against her arm, and she watched the fire, and she waited. An hour passed, maybe longer. The fire needed feeding twice. She did it carefully, precisely, giving it only what it needed to keep going, and no more, because she didn't know how long they'd be here, and the wood wasn't going to last forever. He started shaking somewhere in the second hour. That was, she knew, a good sign. Shivering meant his body was still fighting to generate heat. She'd learned that from her mother, who'd told her once about a man in the tenement building on Halsted Street who'd been brought in from a blizzard and had stopped shivering, and what that meant, and why you had to be more afraid of the quiet cold than the violent kind. She put her arm across him and held on. He said something, not words, a sound from deep in his chest, rough and involuntary. She said, "Stay with me." Her voice was still raw, still not quite hers yet, or maybe it was hers now in a way it hadn't been before. "Stay with me, Wes." Nothing back. His eyes didn't open. She pressed closer. "Live?" she said. The word came out quietly. She said it again, not loudly, not for the canyon or the storm or anyone else, just for him in this cold cave with the small fire working hard at the back wall. "Please." The shivering got worse before it got better. She held on through it. The fire worked. The canvas held what warmth there was. Outside, the storm kept doing what it was doing, and inside the cave, they were separate from it. Barely, but enough. She talked to him. She didn't plan to. She'd spent a year and a half in silence so complete, she'd started to forget what words felt like in her mouth. And then the wall had come down in one raw cry across a canyon, and now words kept arriving whether she sent for them or not. She talked to keep herself awake. She talked because the sound of her own voice, strange and rough as it still was, seemed to do something in the air of the cave that helped her breathe slower and think clearer. She told him about her father's office on LaSalle Street, the books stacked on every flat surface, the smell of old paper and wood polish, the way Arthur Vance would read case files aloud to her, because he said thinking out loud was the only honest way to think. She told him about the boundary case in Indiana, where her father had proved a surveyor's error, not with money or connections, but with a compass. An original government plat map and 4 hours of testimony that had turned the entire courthouse around. She told him about her mother's garden, the rows of herbs in clay pots on every south-facing windowsill, and the way her mother moved through a sick room with the same calm competence that Cassidy had watched Dakota bring to a sick animal. She didn't tell him about the hallway, about the two men she'd seen leaving through the window at the end of the hall, about what she'd found when she opened her father's office door. Some things were facts, and some things were carried differently, and the ones that were carried differently weren't ready yet for words. Maybe someday, not tonight. She talked until his shivering slowed, and his breathing deepened, and then she stopped talking and just listened to him breathe, because after a long time of listening for it, that sound was enough. His eyes opened properly somewhere past what she estimated was midnight, though she had no real way to know. He looked at the ceiling of the cave first, then at the fire, then at her. She watched him put it together. The cliff, the pass, the explosion, the awareness moving slowly back into his face, the way light moves across a room. When the curtains are pulled open, he said. The herd. His voice was rough, but it was there. She held up her hand. 2 fingers spread, then made a forward motion. 2 groups, moving forward. Dakota? She nodded. He tried to sit up straighter. The sound he made was controlled and brief, just a short exhale that meant significant pain, and he stopped moving. She held up both hands in a firm, flat gesture. Stay still. He looked down at the bandaging she'd done on his hip, at the canvas wrapped around them both, at his own shirt, which was not on him. He took a slow, careful inventory. Then he looked at her. He said, "The wound." She made a so-so gesture. He understood what that meant. She watched him understand it and set it aside to deal with later. That capacity of his, the ability to take in a hard fact and file it somewhere that didn't interfere with the next decision, was something she'd noticed in the first days at the ranch and had not stopped noticing. He said, "You came down the cliff face." She looked at him evenly. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. The wind outside did something complicated and moved on. He said, "I heard something when I was falling." He paused. He was working to keep his voice steady and mostly managing it. "I thought I heard someone call my name." She looked at the fire. He said quietly, "That was you." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. She looked back at him, and she said, "Yes." Her voice came out clearer than it had, not like before the silence. Not the voice she remembered from Chicago, certain and quick. Something else. Steadier, maybe. A little harder. The voice of someone who'd carried things a long distance and was still walking. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. She didn't look away. He said, "How long have we been in here?" She held up 2 fingers. 2 hours approximately. More? Maybe. He nodded. He looked at the fire again. He said, "The leg isn't broken. It's bad, but it isn't broken. I'd know the difference." She gestured in a way that said she would make that determination herself. He actually almost smiled. It moved across his face for a second, before the pain caught up with it. She reached into the saddlebag and found the salt beef. She broke off a piece and handed it to him without ceremony. He took it. He ate slowly. She took a piece herself because she hadn't eaten since before dawn, and her hands were still not entirely steady, and she needed the salt and the calories, and the simple act of doing something normal. They sat with their backs against the cave wall and ate hard salt beef in a cave in the middle of a blizzard above Dead Man's Pass, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Wes said, "Your father's files. They're in the bag." She patted the saddlebag at her side. He exhaled. Good. He shifted carefully, and she heard the involuntary catch in his breath that he was doing his best to suppress. Fort Benton is still 2 days north. Callaway will be there through the end of the month. She reached for her notepad. Then she stopped, because the pencil was in her coat pocket, and her coat was over him, and she wasn't going to disturb that arrangement. And besides, She had a voice now, rough and new and present. She said, "We'll get there." The words were plain, no extra weight put on them. Just the fact of them, the same way she'd written things in the notepad for 2 months, the same way she'd handled the survey documents, and the poultice, and the man who'd come through the cabin wall. Here is the situation. Here is what we do. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, with the particular directness he brought to things that mattered to him. Not calculating, not assessing, the way he'd assessed everything in those first days. Something past that. Something that had moved through all the assessments and arrived somewhere else, he said. All right, that was all. She nodded. The fire needed feeding. She got up and fed it, and came back, and settled against the wall beside him again where the warmth was. Outside, the storm was slowing. She could hear it in the quality of the wind, the way it lost its organized fury, and became something more scattered, individual gusts instead of a sustained assault. By morning, the pass would be open. The cattle would be with Dakota, or the ones that hadn't scattered would be, and Dakota would have held whatever he could, because that was what Dakota did. They would get to Fort Benton. She thought about Callaway, about what her father's files contained, specific names, specific dates, specific amounts paid through specific land companies, the long, careful evidentiary chain that Arthur Vance had built one brick at a time over 4 years. She thought about the red wax seal on the broken spur deed. She thought about a judge in Oakhaven who had spent years making himself untouchable by making himself useful to enough powerful people. She thought about what her father used to say when a case looked complicated. He'd clear everything off his desk and start from the beginning, one fact at a time. And he'd say that the law didn't reward the loudest voice or the biggest gun. He said it rewarded patience and documentation, and the willingness to stand up in a room full of hostile witnesses and be unmistakably right. She was very close to being able to do that. She could feel it. Everything they'd done since the blizzard hit the ranch, the poultice, the survey documents, the land office filing, the files in the oilskin pouch, it all led somewhere specific. Sterling had built his power on the assumption that the people he targeted didn't have the knowledge or the resources to fight back correctly. That was the miscalculation that ended things. Wes's breathing had evened out. He was not asleep. She didn't think, but he was resting, his eyes closed, his body doing the slow work of stabilizing itself in the warmth she'd managed to hold in this small stone space. She watched the fire. She was tired in a way that went to the bone and past it. Her hands were still raw from the cliff face. Her feet had come back to painful feeling, which meant they were intact. She was cold and hungry, and had a voice that didn't feel entirely like hers yet. She was, against everything that had happened to her in the past year and a half, not finished. That was her father's word in her father's handwriting, on the last note she'd ever found in his case files, scrawled at the bottom of a page of survey analysis in the familiar quick hand she'd known since childhood. Not finished, just the 2 words, like a reminder he'd left for himself, or maybe for her. She pulled the canvas tighter and watched the fire burn down slowly to its most efficient point, and outside the blizzard ran out of anger, and morning began to come up gray and cold, and entirely possible somewhere beyond the stone walls of the cave. She was not finished. Neither was he. That was enough to work with. Morning came into the cave slowly, gray and thin, pushing through the opening from a sky that had finally stopped fighting. Cassidy heard the silence before she saw the light. The storm had been making itself known all night in that low, pressurized moan through the canyon walls, and when it stopped all at once, the way a long argument ends, not gradually but suddenly, and the quiet it left behind was enormous and clean. She'd slept in short stretches, an hour here, 40 minutes there, waking each time to check the fire and check Wes and feed more wood into the coals before settling back against the cave wall. He'd run a fever through the back half of the night. Not high enough to be the worst kind, but enough to make his breathing ragged and his face hot under her palm and she'd sat close and kept the canvas around them and watched the fire and let the hours pass, because there was nothing to do about a fever except manage what you could manage and wait out what you couldn't. By the time real light reached the cave mouth, his skin had cooled. He woke up before she did, which she realized only when she felt him shift and looked over to find his eyes already open, looking at the cave ceiling with the focused expression of a man working through a set of problems in order of urgency. He did a slow inventory, eyes moving from the cave walls to the dying fire, to the canvas over him, to his hip where her bandaging was holding. Then he looked at her. She lifted her eyebrows. "A question," he said, "better." His voice was rough from the fever, but steady underneath it. "How's the fire?" She tilted her hand. "Running low. We should move while there's daylight." She was already folding the canvas. Getting Wes up the cliff face was not a fast process. They both understood that going in, and neither of them wasted breath pretending otherwise. She went first, finding the handholds and testing each one, calling down to him what she'd found. Her voice was still new and strange in her own ears, but it worked, and she used it without ceremony because the situation required words, and she had them now. He climbed with his jaw set and said nothing about his hip or his leg, which told her more than if he'd said a great deal about either. At the places where the rock was iced, she talked him through it. At the one place where the slope was nearly vertical, she went back down and climbed alongside him, with her shoulder pressed against his to give him a point to press against. They made the trail in 40 minutes. The pass was unrecognizable. The rockfall had spread debris across the narrow ledge, and snow had covered most of it overnight into smooth, deceptive humps of white. The trail was passable, barely with care. She found her hat wedged against a boulder, and she put it on, and they crossed the pass without speaking, moving deliberately through the debris field in the cold morning air. The bay was gone. Wes's horse had made it off the ledge shelf during the chaos. She hoped the animal had found its way back to familiar ground. She hoped Dakota had found it. She had no way to know yet. Birch was where she'd left her, tied to a scrub pine at the east end of the pass, with a loose knot Dakota had taught her to use specifically for emergency situations. A knot that kept the horse secure, but would give if the animal panicked badly enough. Birch had stayed. The mare looked at them both with the calm, evaluating expression she'd had since the first morning, and let Cassidy check her legs before standing steady for both of them to mount. She rode. Wes sat behind her, one arm around her waist for balance, his grip even and controlled, not tight, the grip of a man conserving energy rather than holding on for his life. Still, she could feel the effort it cost him, the tension in his arm when Birch moved over uneven ground. She kept the mare steady and slow, and picked the flattest line through the snow. They found Dakota 2 miles north of the pass. He was camped in a stand of timber off the main trail, with what remained of the herd, 41 cattle present, and accounted for, in a rough semicircle around a fire that he'd clearly been tending all night. He had the bay with him, which answered that question. He looked up when they came out of the trees and looked at them both with the thoroughness of someone running a damage assessment. And whatever he found seemed to satisfy him because he stood up without a lot of ceremony and said, "Coffee's hot." That was the reunion. They spent 2 hours in that camp. She redressed Wes's wound with proper supplies from Dakota's pack, and Dakota fed the cattle from the grain bags he'd salvaged from the scattered gear, and they ate and drank coffee and talked through what had happened and what came next. 19 head lost. Some would have scattered and might make their way back eventually. Some were gone in the pass. 41 was not 60. 41 was enough to make the delivery at Fort Benton, maybe enough to cover the December payment, not enough to also cover February. That math sat in the air between all three of them, and nobody called it anything except what it was. Dakota said. "The mercenaries." "Down," Wes said. He was sitting against a pine with his leg extended and a cup of coffee in both hands, and his color was coming back by degrees. "Sterling will send more. After the drive, we'll be back at the ranch before he can mobilize again." Dakota looked at him steadily. You sure about that? Wes looked back at him steadily. No. Dakota nodded. That was the honest answer, and he accepted it. They broke camp mid-morning and moved north. The 2 days to Fort Benton were cold and clear and hard. Wes rode the bay at a pace that was slower than their original plan and faster than his hip was probably recommending. And he didn't mention it, and she didn't ask him to. Dakota scouted ahead. Cassidy rode flank on Birch and kept the herd moving with a competence she hadn't entirely possessed 3 weeks ago and did now, something that had transferred from watching Dakota work and paying close attention and simply doing the work until the doing of it became second nature. She talked more than she had, not constantly, but when there was something to say, she said it. When she spotted a gap in the herd's right flank, she called it out to Dakota rather than signaling. When Wes asked her what she thought about the Northern Creek crossing, she told him in 3 sentences what the water level looked like and which line she'd take through it. The words came out plain and direct, the same as everything else she did. He listened to her the same way. He'd read her notes, completely. Fort Benton arrived on the 3rd afternoon as a dark line against the flat gray sky, resolving slowly into walls and rooftops, and the smell of wood smoke and horse, and the particular human density of a place where the frontier met something more organized. The Missouri River ran wide and brown beyond the fort walls. The military flag snapped in a cold wind off the water. They drove the cattle through the main gate in the blue early light of late afternoon. It did not go smoothly. The receiving agent was a man named Collier, compact and thin-faced, with a ledger book under one arm and a manner that suggested he'd made a career out of finding technical reasons to pay less than had been agreed. He came out to meet them at the holding pens with 2 clerks behind him, looked at the 41 head, looked at his ledger, and began to explain that the original contract had specified 60 head of healthy cattle, and that what they were presenting did not constitute the agreed delivery quantity, and that, furthermore, a visual inspection suggested several animals were underweight, and that, in consideration of these factors, revised terms would be necessary. He named a figure. It was less than half of what the original contract specified. Wes said, "That's not a revised figure. That's an insult," Collier said, unruffled, that he was simply applying standard contractual adjustments for non-conforming delivery, and that if Mr. Gage wished to discuss the matter, he was welcome to review the terms with the fort's purchasing officer in the morning. Cassidy had been standing slightly behind Wes during this exchange, listening. She had her father's saddlebag over her shoulder, the same one she'd carried down the cliff face in the blizzard. She had her notepad in her coat pocket, and she hadn't touched it. She looked at Collier, she looked at his ledger, she looked at the 2 clerks behind him. She walked past all 3 of them, not around. Past, directly, with the focused forward movement of someone who has a destination and is already there in her mind. She crossed the fort yard toward the main building, the one with the commanding officer's flag above the door, and she pushed it open and went in. Wes watched her go. Dakota came up beside him. He said nothing. Wes looked at Collier, who was watching the door with a slightly confused expression. Wes said, "I'd wait if I were you." Inside the main building, there was a hallway and then a large room that served as the fort's administrative center, maps on the walls, a long table covered in papers, 3 officers in various states of work. At the far end sat a man with silver at his temples and the posture of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them. Commander Aldrich. His name was on the correspondence Wes had received when he'd originally arranged the cattle contract. He looked up when Cassidy came in. She stood across the table from him. She'd taken her hat off. Her dark hair was down from 2 days of hard riding, and her coat was worn, and she had a bruise along her jaw from the rockfall debris she hadn't mentioned to anyone. She looked like someone who had been through something significant and had not found it particularly interesting. She said, "Sir, my name is Cassidy Vance. I have a delivery contract issued from this office for 60 head of prime Montana cattle." Her voice had found more of its shape over the past 2 days. It was still rougher than it once was, and probably always would be, but it was clear and even, and carried across the room without effort. 41 head have been delivered. The remaining 19 were lost in a mercenary ambush organized by Judge Malachi Sterling of Oakhaven County. I have documentation connecting Sterling to a fraudulent survey operation that defrauded multiple homesteaders of their land under color of law, including the use of forged deeds bearing his personal seal. The room was quiet. She opened the saddlebag. She laid her father's survey documentation on the table first, then the overlap claim filed against the broken spur, with her own hand-drawn diagram showing the 12-foot discrepancy between the original government survey and the claim measurements. Then the land transfer deed pulled from the coat of the man who'd come through the cabin wall, with Sterling's red wax seal at the bottom. She said, "The 41 head delivered today represent an honest partial delivery under circumstances of deliberate, organized interference. Your receiving agent is proposing payment at less than half the contracted rate, citing non-conforming quantity." She looked at Aldrich directly. "I would like you to review the original contract terms and the circumstances of delivery before accepting his assessment." Aldrich looked at the documents. He picked up the deed with Sterling's seal. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the survey diagram. He looked up at her. "Who is your father?" she said. "Arthur Vance, attorney, Chicago. He was killed in March of 1877 while preparing this documentation for federal court." The room was very quiet again. Aldrich set the deed down. He picked up the contract, the original one, and read through it with the focused attention of a man who does not read documents casually. He turned a page. He turned another. He said, "The contract specifies 60 head as the delivery quantity, but contains a force majeure provision on page 4. He looked up. Acts of organized violence against a contracted party would fall within that provision, she said. "Yes, sir, they would." He studied her for another moment. Then he stood up. "Where is Mr. Gage?" she said. "At the holding pens. He has a bullet wound in his hip that he is pretending is less serious than it is." Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction. He looked at the officers in the room and said, "Get the surgeon," and walked toward the door. Cassidy gathered the documents back into order and followed him. What happened in the fort yard over the next hour was methodical and thoroughly satisfying, in the specific way that things are satisfying when they go right after a long stretch of nothing going right at all. Aldrich spoke to Collier briefly, and in a tone that didn't invite discussion. Collier's ledger book closed. The clerks behind him lost their bored expressions and gained new ones. The surgeon arrived, took one look at Wes, and started directing people with the efficient authority of someone who has been managing stubborn wounded men for 20 years. Wes argued with him for about 45 seconds and then stopped, which meant the wound was probably worse than he'd let on, and submitted to being examined in the surgery with only minimal additional commentary. Dakota supervised the official weighing and inspection of the cattle with an impassive thoroughness that left Collier with very little room to find objections. And the head count came out at 41 healthy animals, range-fit and well-maintained despite the trail conditions. The officers who drifted out of the main building to watch the proceedings had the look of men who didn't see a great deal of unusual activity in their daily routine, and were finding this afternoon more interesting than most. Aldrich stood with Cassidy near the holding pens while the final tally was completed. He had the survey documentation in his hand. He said, "This is federal territory Sterling has been operating in. This documentation, if it holds up to scrutiny, represents several federal crimes," she said. "It will hold up. My father spent 4 years building it." Aldrich looked at her. He said, "I'll want to take copies, and I want the name of the marshal you intend to contact." She said, "Calloway, U.S. Marshals, Fort Benton," he said. "Calloway is a good man." He looked back at the documents. "You'll want to move fast. Sterling will know. The ambush failed inside a week," she said. "I know. He handed the documents back to her. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man accustomed to judging people quickly and usually correctly. He said, "Your father was right to teach you what he did." She said, "Yes, he was." It was not a small thing to say. She knew it when she said it. There had been months when the thought of her father came with such a wave of weight attached to it that she'd had to set it aside just to keep moving, to stop herself from sitting down somewhere and not getting back up. She hadn't spoken his name out loud in over a year. She'd carried him in her chest like something fragile that she was afraid to touch for fear of dropping it. Saying it plainly, in a fort yard in Fort Benton with the river behind her and the work in front of her, was different. He was right. He had been right. She was here because he had taught her. And the teaching was going to matter, and that was the thing he would have wanted more than anything else. She went to find Wes. He was in the surgery, sitting on a cot, with his coat off, looking mildly affronted by the experience of being attended to. The surgeon had properly cleaned and redressed the hip wound and was delivering his professional opinion on the question of continued movement versus rest. Wes was listening with the expression of a man who is agreeing to nothing. She came in and stood in the doorway. The surgeon looked at her. He said, "3 days rest minimum," she said. "We'll have 2, the surgeon said. "You people are going to be the death of me." Wes looked at her from the cot. Something in his expression had loosened. Some held tension that had been there since before the pass, since probably before the cattle drive. He looked tired and pale and genuinely relieved in a way she hadn't seen from him before. He said, "Aldrich?" She said, "Full contract payment. Gold coin as specified." A pause, he said, "How?" She told him about the force majeure provision on page 4. He listened and then looked at her with the same expression he'd had when she'd first shown him the 12-foot survey discrepancy, that brief stillness before acknowledgement. He said, "I didn't read page 4. She said, "I know." He absorbed that. He said, "Collier," she said. "Won't be a problem." He looked at her for another moment. He stood up from the cot, carefully, and the surgeon made a sound of professional protest that Wes did not acknowledge. He picked up his coat. He looked at her, and his eyes moved over her face with that directness she'd come to understand was simply how he looked at things that mattered to him. No deflection, no performance. He said, "Come here." She crossed the room. He took her hand. Not the way you take someone's hand to check it for injury. He held it, deliberately, with the same intention he brought to everything, and then he walked her back out into the fort yard with her hand in his, and the surgeon saying something exasperated behind them that neither of them paid any attention to. The cattle payment had drawn a crowd of sorts. Soldiers and traders and the working population of the fort, drawn by the unusual spectacle of a woman who had apparently walked into the commander's office and reshaped a purchasing negotiation. They stood in loose groups near the holding pens and watched Dakota receive the gold and count it with meticulous care and wrap it in the leather wallet Wes had brought for the purpose. Wes stopped in the middle of the yard. He looked at the people watching. He looked at Dakota, who glanced up from the counting and caught his eye and gave a small, precise nod. He looked at Cassidy, he said, "She isn't just my wife." His voice carried across the yard without effort, the same flat, carrying quiet it always had. People turned. He said, "She is the mind and heart of the broken spur." She looked at him. There was nothing elaborate about the way he said it. No performance, no speech-making, no particular awareness of the audience beyond the basic fact of them. He said it because it was true, and saying true things plainly was the only way he operated. And this was a true thing he wanted said where people could hear it. She stood in the middle of Fort Benton, with the Missouri River behind the walls and the cold November wind coming off the water and the weight of her father's documents in the saddlebag at her shoulder, and she looked at this man who had put a silver dollar on a bar in a saloon and told her she owed him nothing but honesty and had meant it in every way that a person can mean something. She said, "Then let's go home." He looked at her. He kept hold of her hand. They stood there for a moment, the two of them in the middle of the fort yard with Dakota behind them, and the cattle in the pens and the gold in the wallet, and everything still ahead of them. Sterling, and the land office, and the February payment, and Calloway, and the federal case that her father had spent 4 years building, and she was going to finish. All of it still in front of them. A long road, hard and specific and real. She wasn't afraid of it. She was, for the first time since she'd stood in the hallway of an office on LaSalle Street, and understood in one terrible moment what the world had done. Not afraid of what came next. The clouds had been breaking up since midday, and the late afternoon light came through in flat, long shafts across the fort, the kind of western light that turns everything it touches briefly golden. The river, and the walls, and the brown November grass beyond the gate. Dakota tucked the wallet inside his coat and came up alongside them, the horses already collected, everything packed for the trail back south. He looked at the two of them. He looked at their joined hands. He said, "Calloway's office is on the main street. We should go before he leaves for the day." Wes said, "Yes." They walked toward the gate. The cattle money came home in gold coin, heavy in the leather wallet, and it wasn't enough. Wes knew it before he counted it. He'd run the numbers in his head on the ride back from Fort Benton, lying on his side in the wagon bed with his hip wrapped tight and the Montana sky moving above him, gray and enormous and indifferent to his arithmetic. The December payment was covered. The February one wasn't, not even close, and Sterling had apparently spent the 2 weeks they were on the trail doing what men like Sterling do when they sense an opening. The foreclosure notice was nailed to the cabin door when they got back. Dakota pulled it free without a word and handed it to Cassidy. She read it standing in the yard, still in her trailcoat birch, not yet unsaddled behind her. Then she read it again. Then she handed it to Wes. It was dated 4 days ago, a county court order signed by Sterling himself in his capacity as magistrate, citing unpaid interest on the original mortgage. The interest figures listed were wrong, not approximately wrong, specifically, deliberately, documentably wrong, numbers that didn't match any payment record Wes had kept in 6 years of ledger books, numbers that had been invented by someone who assumed the man they were inventing them against wouldn't be able to prove the invention. Sterling had made that mistake before. He'd made it with Cassidy's father. Wes looked at the notice. He looked at the tree line. He looked at Cassidy. She was already walking to the cabin door. She already had the notepad out. Not to write in. She was flipping back through weeks of notes, cross-referencing something in her head, her face doing the particular thing it did when she was 6 steps ahead of where everyone else was standing. She stopped. She wrote. She held the notepad up. "He filed this while we were on the trail. He expected us not to come back." "Yes," Wes said. She wrote again. "Or he expected us to come back with less money than the payment requires and accept whatever terms he offered." Also yes. She looked at the notice one more time. Then she tucked it inside her coat with the same hands that had cauterized a bullet wound in a mountain cave and climbed a cliff face in a blizzard and applied poultice to 60 sets of infected hooves. And she went inside and started making coffee. Wes stood in the yard for a moment. He'd expected to feel the way a man feels when the thing he's been fighting finally closes in. Tired, maybe, resigned to something. Instead, he just felt clear, the kind of clarity that comes when the situation gets simple enough that the path forward stops being a question. He went inside. He sat at the table. He picked up his pencil. "Tell me what we need," he said. She slid the notepad across. They worked through the night. By morning, they had 2 things. A complete accounting of every mortgage payment Wes had made in 6 years, documented with receipts and ledger entries and dated bank correspondence. Proof that the interest figures in Sterling's notice were fabricated by a margin of over $400. And a list of names. The names were the second thing, and in some ways the more important one. Cassidy had been keeping that list since the first week at the ranch, building it quietly in the back pages of her notepad, from things Wes had mentioned in passing and things she'd read in the county records. and things Dakota had told her about the other families in the valley. Homesteaders who'd lost land to overlapping survey claims. Native ranchers who'd been driven off water rights they'd held for years. Veterans who'd come west after the war and built something and watched it get dismantled by a man who wore a judge's robe and operated like a thief. 14 families. She'd written them all down. She showed the list to Wes. He read it. He looked at her. "You want to go to them?" She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the list again. He said, "Sterling will move fast once he knows the foreclosure notice didn't work. We've got maybe 2 weeks before he tries something else." She wrote, "Then we move faster." They rode out the next morning, all 3 of them, Dakota on his paint and Cassidy on birch, and Wes still moving carefully on the bay but moving, and they went to every name on the list. It took 4 days. Some of the conversations were short. A Swedish homesteader named Erickson, who'd lost 80 acres on the South Creek to a claim he'd never been properly notified about, listened to Cassidy lay out what they'd found in the county records and didn't say much for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I was the only one. That was all." He came. A Crow family named Bulchiff, who ran cattle on the North Range, had been fighting a water rights dispute with one of Sterling's subsidiary companies for 2 years. Dakota spoke with them. The conversation took most of an afternoon and covered ground that Cassidy and Wes stayed respectfully back from, because it wasn't theirs to enter. At the end, Dakota came back to where they were waiting and said, "They'll come." Not everyone said yes. 2 families were too frightened, and Cassidy didn't push them, because fear that size comes from experience she hadn't lived and couldn't argue with. She thanked them and left the door open and moved on. 11 families said yes. They met in the Broken Spur Barn on a Thursday night in late November, crowded in among the hay bales and the smell of horses and lantern oil. People who'd driven or ridden through cold and dark because someone had asked them to, and the asking had felt different from the other times. They'd been asked things by people with land and money and an agenda. Cassidy stood at the front of the space near the lantern. She hadn't prepared a speech. She'd prepared documentation, which was different and more useful. She laid out what they had. Sterling's pattern, the survey filings, the fraudulent interest claims, the land transfer deeds with the red wax seal. She talked about her father's case files, about the chain of evidence that connected 4 years of fraud in a line so clear a federal court would have no trouble following it. She talked plainly and used plain words, the same way she'd written in the notepad all those weeks, because the thing she was describing wasn't complicated at its core. Someone was stealing from people by making the law too difficult to understand. The answer was to make it understandable. A man near the back, a rancher named Hooper who'd lost a water easement 2 years ago, said, "All well and good, ma'am, but the law here is Sterling," she said. "The county law is Sterling. The federal law isn't." The room was quiet. She said, "My father spent 4 years building a case that federal prosecutors can use. We have a marshal in Fort Benton who's already reviewed part of it. Sterling has power inside this county because he's made himself the highest authority inside this county. Outside it, he's a corrupt magistrate whose paper trail leads directly to a murder." Another voice, a woman this time, from somewhere in the middle of the room. "What do you need from us?" Cassidy looked at her. She said, "Testimony. Documented accounts of every action Sterling or his agents took against your land, your water, your deeds. Written, dated, signed. Each one adds a brick to what my father started building." A pause. "He taught me that the law rewards patience and documentation, and the willingness to stand up in a room full of hostile witnesses and be unmistakably right," Hooper said, from the back. "You've been standing up all right so far." A few people laughed. It broke something loose in the room. The conversation that followed was loud and specific and went on for 2 hours, people pulling out their own papers, their own records, asking Cassidy questions she answered directly, asking Dakota questions he answered with equal directness, occasionally asking Wes things and Wes saying yes or no with his usual economy of words. By the time the barn emptied out, they had 11 sets of signed testimonies. Cassidy sat at the workbench after everyone had gone and went through them by lamplight. organizing them into the sequence that would make the most sense for a federal proceeding. Her breath visible in the cold air, her coat buttoned to the chin. Wes brought her coffee without being asked. He sat on a hay bale nearby and watched her work. He said, "You know this isn't a classroom." She looked up. He said, "What you're doing is real. The moment those testimonies go to Calloway, Sterling knows this valley has turned on him. He won't wait for a courtroom." She held his gaze. She said, "I know." He looked at the organized stack of papers in front of her. He said, "Your father knew that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He went forward anyway." Wes looked at her. He said, "Yes, he did." She turned back to the papers. She kept working. He didn't tell her to stop. Outside, the valley was cold and dark, and the stars were out, enormous over the Montana basin, the kind of sky you couldn't see anywhere that had too much civilization in it. The broken spur barn threw a thin rectangle of yellow light into the yard. Inside it, two people sat among the evidence of 11 other lives and did the quiet, unglamorous work of building something that could last. Sterling's notice was still in her coat pocket. She'd use it. Everything he'd given them, they'd use. She turned a page. She kept going. The morning of the hearing was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything sharp and clean, edges defined, shadows long. Wes rode into Oakhaven with Cassidy on Birch beside him, and Dakota a few lengths back, and the town had the particular stillness of a place where people know something is about to happen and have decided to watch from inside. They weren't alone. Behind them, spread across the North Road in ones and twos and small family groups, were the people from the barn, Erickson on his cart, the Bull Chief family, riding 4 abreast, Hooper and his wife, and 2 of their grown sons. 11 families moving toward Oakhaven on a cold December morning because a woman with a worn notepad and a raw, steady voice had stood in a barn and told them what they were owed. The courthouse was a 2-story frame building on the main street, wider than most of the buildings around it, with the territorial flag above the door and Sterling's name on the placard beside it. Sterling's men were already outside. 6 of them, Harlan Briggs in front with his blond mustache and his flat, pale eyes, the others arranged behind him in the way men arrange themselves when they want to look like a wall. Briggs looked at the crowd coming down the road. He looked at Wes. He said, "This isn't a public gathering, Gage. The judge issued a private foreclosure proceeding." Wes said, "Then the judge should have been more careful with his jurisdiction." He swung down from the bay. His hip had been 3 weeks healing, and it wasn't done, but it held. He walked toward the courthouse door. Briggs stepped sideways to block it. Wes stopped. For a moment, the whole street was still. Then the door behind Briggs opened from the inside, and 2 men came out in the tan coats of the U.S. Marshal's office, and Briggs turned around, and the expression on his face went through several stages in rapid succession before settling on something cold and very careful. The marshal in front was a rangy, weathered man with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had seen a great deal and stopped being impressed by most of it. His name was Calloway. He looked at Briggs. He said, "You're in my way." Briggs looked back at him. He looked at the second marshal. He looked at Wes. He stepped aside. Calloway looked at Wes. He said, "Gage." He looked at Cassidy. Something moved across his face. "Miss Vance, I've been waiting to meet you," she said, Marshal. He looked at the crowd behind them. He said, "You brought witnesses," she said. 11 families, undated testimonies, documented losses going back 4 years. He nodded, slow, the nod of a man who has been building toward something for a long time and is watching the last piece come into place, he said. "Come inside." The courthouse had a main room that served as Sterling's courtroom, benches arranged in rows, the judge's elevated desk at the front. Sterling was already seated there in his black robe, a heavy-jowled man with a carefully maintained dignity that fit him the way an expensive coat fits someone who bought it to be seen in rather than to wear. He had 2 of his own legal men at a table on the right. He had not expected what walked through his door. His expression didn't break immediately. Men like Sterling have a great deal of practice holding their expressions in place. But Cassidy saw the moment when the calculation shifted behind his eyes. The two marshals, Wes, the people filing in from outside, filling the benches, standing along the walls. And then two more people she'd been waiting for. A man and a woman from the Chicago Tribune, who'd been on the morning stage from the Northern Rail connection, their notebooks already out. She had written to them 6 weeks ago, from Fort Benton, the same day she'd met with Calloway the first time. She walked to the table on the left side of the room and put down her father's case files. She put down the survey documentation, the overlap claim with the 12-foot discrepancy, the land transfer deed with Sterling's seal, 11 testimony packets from the Valley families. She arranged them in order. She sat down. Wes sat beside her. Calloway said to the room, "This proceeding is now under federal jurisdiction." He looked at Sterling. "Judge Sterling, you've been served with a federal warrant. I'd advise you to listen carefully to what's presented," Sterling said, in the voice he used when he was certain of his authority. "This is a county matter." "You have no standing to," Calloway said. "You used your county standing to file fraudulent survey claims on federal land territories. That gives me considerable standing." He looked at Cassidy, Miss Vance. She stood up. She had given testimony before, in her father's courtroom visits, sitting in the gallery watching him work. She understood the architecture of a legal argument. You build from foundation to frame to roof, and you don't skip levels, and you don't make claims you can't support, and you stay calm, because calm is more persuasive than passion, and also harder to dismiss. She started with the survey discrepancy. She walked the room through the original government documentation and the overlap claim filed 8 months ago. The 12-foot difference at the Creek Bend marker, the hand-drawn diagram that showed both measurements side by side in red and black ink. She explained what that discrepancy represented: 300 acres of prime creek pasture held in artificial dispute, the effect on Wes's credit, the mortgage clause that had been quietly ticking toward acceleration. She moved to the land transfer deed. She held it up. She said, "This deed was found on the person of an armed man who broke into the Broken Spur cabin in October of this year with the stated intent of recovering my father's case files." The seal at the bottom is Sterling's personal magistrate's seal. The property described is the Broken Spur. The deed transfers ownership to Meridian Valley Holdings. She set it down. She said, "Meridian Valley Holdings is a shell company registered in St. Louis. My father identified it in 1876 as a vehicle for land fraud in the Montana and Dakota territories. It appears in his case files connected to 9 fraudulent survey filings and 4 forced property transfers. All 9 filings bear the same surveyor's measurements. All 4 transfers bear the same magistrate's seal." She picked up the top folder from her father's files. She opened it to the relevant page. She said, "My father's handwriting, dated 2 weeks before he was killed." She read the notation aloud, not word for word, because she understood copyright in both senses of the term, the legal and the human. She described its content plainly: a surveyor's seal matched across 4 Montana filings, a magistrate's identity not yet confirmed, but the investigation ongoing. She said, "He had identified the seal. He hadn't confirmed the name." She looked up. She said, "I'm confirming it now." Sterling's legal men were writing rapidly. Sterling himself was very still. She went through the 11 family testimonies in sequence. She didn't read each one aloud entirely. She summarized the pattern they created: water rights disputed through procedural filings, land boundaries redrawn without proper notification, interest rates on county-held mortgages adjusted through records that had been quietly altered. She noted dates. She cited corresponding entries in Sterling's own county record books, which Calloway had requisitioned the previous day. It took 2 hours. When she finished, the room was quiet in a particular way. Not empty quiet, full quiet, the kind that comes when a great many people have heard a great many facts arranged in an order that makes denial very difficult. Sterling said, "This is the testimony of a woman with an obvious personal grievance." His voice had shed its dignity somewhere in the second hour without his appearing to notice. Her father was a man with a reputation for building elaborate fictions around. "Calloway," said Judge Sterling. Sterling stopped. Calloway said, "Don't." Sterling looked at him. Calloway said, There are 2 reporters in this room and 11 signed witnesses and a federal warrant with your name on it. I'd suggest your next words be chosen with great care." The room sat in its full quiet. Sterling stood up. It happened fast. He moved his hand inside his robe and came out with the sidearm he'd been carrying there, a small revolver, and his face had shed everything by then, the dignity and the calculation and the practiced authority, and what was underneath was just a man who had built something rotten over a long time and was watching it come apart and could not find any other option. He didn't get to fire it. Wes was already moving. He'd been watching Sterling's right hand for the last 20 minutes. In the particular way, he watched things he expected to need to respond to. And when the hand moved, he was up and across the space between them before the gun was fully out. He got his hand around Sterling's wrist. He drove it upward. The revolver went into the ceiling, and the plaster came down in a small white cloud, and then they were against the wall, and the gun was on the floor, and Sterling was pinned against the paneling, with Wes's forearm across his chest, and the quiet in the room had become a completely different kind of quiet. Calloway stepped forward. His own weapon was out, he said. "Mr. Gage." Wes stepped back. His breathing was controlled. His hip was probably not happy with any of that, but his face didn't show it. Calloway picked up Sterling's revolver. He looked at Sterling. He said, "Malachi Sterling, you're under arrest on federal charges of land fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Arthur Vance of Chicago, Illinois." Sterling said nothing. He looked at Cassidy. She looked back at him. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, standing in this room across from the man responsible for what had happened on LaSalle Street 18 months ago. She'd thought it might be larger. What it actually was turned out to be something quieter. The specific feeling of a thing being finished. Her father's unfinished sentence closed. The marshals took Sterling out. The room exhaled. Hooper said, from the bench, to nobody in particular, "Well." Somebody else said, "That's about right." One of the Tribune reporters was writing so fast, his pencil was making a sound across the room. Cassidy stood at the table and began carefully gathering the documents, returning each one to its proper place in the files. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady the whole time, and they were steady now. Wes came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He handed her a folder she'd set aside at the edge of the table. She took it. She kept working. Dakota came in from the back of the room where he'd been standing and said, "The Bull Chief family wants to speak with Calloway about the water rights separately." Cassidy said, "I'll come. I have documentation for that, too." Dakota looked at her. Something in his expression that she'd learned over these months to read as approval. He said, "Your father would have been good at this." She said, "I know." She said it without the weight she'd been carrying it with for a year and a half. Just truth, clean and plain. He taught me everything I use today. She closed the last folder. She looked around the room at the people still there, the Valley families, the marshals, the reporters scribbling at the back. At the elevated desk where Sterling had sat in his judge's robe for years, operating on the assumption that the people he was stealing from didn't know enough to stop him. That was the miscalculation. It always had been. She picked up the files. She walked toward the door. She said, without turning around, "Let's go finish it." Spring came to the Bear Paw foothills, slow and deliberate, the way it always does in Montana, a little thaw at a time, the snow pulling back up the slopes through March and April until the lower meadows showed brown and wet, and then, sometime in late April, green. The broken spur greened up along with everything else. A year had passed since a tarnished silver dollar had hit a bar top in the Silver Strike Saloon. More precisely, 13 months. Cassidy had counted them the way you count the distance between where you started and where you are now. Not obsessively, but honestly, because knowing how far you've come is part of knowing what you're capable of. The Valley had spent the winter rebuilding. Sterling's arrest had moved fast through the federal system, the way cases move when the evidence is meticulous, and the prosecuting marshals have been waiting years for the right documentation. 3 of his subsidiary land companies had been dissolved by court order by February. 14 property transfers had been ruled fraudulent and reversed. The Broken Spur's eastern boundary was confirmed by a federal surveyor at the original government measurements in January, which meant the 300 acres of creek pasture were fully secured, and the bank's acceleration clause had nothing left to bite on. The February mortgage payment had been made from the returned proceeds of the wrongful interest overcharges. Wes had stood at the bank counter and handed over a certified document showing the overpayment and a calculation of the corrected balance, and watched the bank officer's expression go through several interesting phases. Cassidy had stood beside him and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The barn school had continued through the winter, twice a week by lamplight, homesteaders and native families sitting on hay bales and at sawhorses, and learning the vocabulary that had been kept away from them on purpose: easements, surveys, adverse possession, contract law, how to read a deed, how to spot a fraudulent one, how to file a proper challenge. Cassidy taught. Sometimes Dakota taught. Sometimes a rancher named Erickson, who turned out to have been a schoolteacher in Sweden before the war, taught alongside her. People came from further out as spring approached. Word had traveled the way. Word travels in places where people are hungry for something they didn't think anyone was offering. By March, the barn held 40 people on a Tuesday night. The cattle had been restocked through a combination of the Fort Benton payment, the returned mortgage overage, and a cooperative arrangement with the Bull Chief family, who had cattle to sell now that their water rights had been restored and were willing to sell to neighbors at fair price. 60 head again by April. Healthy, well-fed, their hooves checked weekly out of a habit that Cassidy had instituted, and that Wes and Dakota had adopted without discussion. The cabin had a new back wall. Wes had rebuilt it himself in January, proper double-chinked logs, no gaps. He'd also built a second room off the east side, small but solid, with a window that faced the mountain. He hadn't explained why. She hadn't asked. She'd walked in, looked at the window, and the light it let in, and the view of the bear paw peaks it framed, and gone back to the main room and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The wedding was Dakota's idea. He'd said it one morning in February while they were checking the cattle, said it the same way he said most things, plainly and without any particular emphasis, as if it were simply the next logical item on a list. He said, "You should do this properly." He said it to both of them, his eyes on the cattle, and then he walked on ahead to check the far fence line and left them standing there in the snow. They had stood there for a moment. Wes had looked at Cassidy. She'd looked at him. Neither of them had said anything for about 30 seconds. Then she'd said, "He's not wrong." Wes had said, "No, he's usually not." That had been February. The ceremony was set for the second Saturday in May, which was when the wildflowers on the East Meadow could be counted on to be at their most unreasonable, great sweeping drifts of yellow and purple and white that came back every spring without being asked, the kind of thing the mountains produced casually that would have cost a fortune anywhere else. They'd invited the whole valley. The whole valley came. Erickson built the benches, actual lumber this time, not hay bales, set in rows on the East Meadow with the Bearpaw Peaks behind them and the morning sky overhead, clear and deep blue in the way May skies are clear in Montana, a blue that looked like it went on longer than the sky had any right to go. The Bolchev family brought food, more food than the occasion required, which was exactly the right amount. A man from the south end of the valley, who nobody had known played fiddle, turned out to play fiddle, and he set up near the tree line and started in the middle of the morning and didn't stop until late afternoon. Calloway came. He rode up from Fort Benton, a day's travel, and stood at the back of the crowd in his marshal's coat, looking like a man who didn't attend many weddings but was finding this one worthwhile. The Tribune reporter came, which Cassidy had not expected. He'd sent a letter in March saying he intended to write a piece on the valley and the case, and what had happened at the Oak Haven courthouse, and apparently he decided to witness the final chapter in person. He had his notebook out within 20 minutes. She didn't mind. The ceremony was simple because they were both people who preferred things simple. A circuit preacher named Barnes who came through Oakhaven every 2 months and was genuinely fond of people in a way that made his services feel like something more than a transaction. A few words from Barnes. A few words from Wes, which surprised some people who'd never heard him, produced more than a sentence at a stretch, and which he delivered with the same level, carrying voice he used for everything, looking at Cassidy the whole time. A few words from Cassidy. Her voice had been building itself back for 7 months. It wasn't the same voice it had been in Chicago. Lighter and quicker. It was this voice now, the one that had come out of her on a cliff face in a blizzard and steadied itself through a cave in a courtroom and 40 winter nights teaching land law to people in a barn by lantern light. She didn't mind that it was different. Different meant she'd been somewhere and come back. She said what she needed to say. She said it plainly. After Barnes finished, Wes reached into his coat pocket. She'd wondered sometimes where the silver dollar had gone. She'd last seen it on the bar of the Silver Strike Saloon on a night in October that felt both very recent and very long ago. She'd never asked about it, because there were things with Wes that didn't need asking. They simply arrived when they were ready. It had been drilled through and fitted on a leather cord, the tarnish polished out of it. Worn smooth on one face from 14 months in a coat pocket, and smooth on the other from whatever process he'd put it through to get it to catch light the way it did now. Not flashy, just present. He put the cord over her head. The dollar sat against her collarbone. This dollar once bought your freedom from a cruel world. He said it simply, the way he said true things. Today it stands as proof that respect and hope are worth more than all the gold in Montana. She looked down at it. She looked up at him. She said, "We didn't buy a life, Wes. We found each other, and we proved that love and human dignity can conquer any darkness." The fiddle started up somewhere behind the crowd. People cheered, the genuine kind, the kind that comes from people who have been through something difficult alongside you and are cheering for what it means that you made it to the other side. Dakota was standing at the edge of the celebration, slightly apart from the main crowd in the way he always positioned himself, from which position he could see everything clearly. He was watching them with the same expression he'd had at Fort Benton when Wes had taken Cassidy's hand in the fort yard. Not sentimental. Something more durable than that. He looked at them and nodded once, slow, and then turned and walked toward the food table. High praise from Dakota. Later in the afternoon, when the celebration had settled into its easier rhythms, food and conversation, and the fiddle moving through something slower, Cassidy found herself standing at the edge of the east meadow, with the wildflowers behind her and the valley spread out below, the ranch and the corrals and the new barn and the creek line running silver through the pasture. She had the silver dollar in her hand. She'd taken it off the cord briefly, just to hold it the way you hold something when you want to understand it properly. It was warm from her skin, lighter than she'd expected, for something that had carried so much. $1. A coat offered in the cold. A cup of coffee set on a floor several feet away from where someone was sitting with an iron fork and a great deal of fear. An unloaded revolver placed handle first toward someone who needed the weight of a thing, even if the thing itself wasn't ready to work yet. Small choices, patient ones. Her father used to say that the law was the most powerful weapon in a free country because it was the one weapon that multiplied when you shared it. A gun you gave away left you unarmed. Knowledge of your rights given to someone else left you both stronger. She looked out over the valley. 40 people at a barn school on a Tuesday night. 11 families who knew now what they were owed and how to say so. A valley that had spent a winter learning the vocabulary of its own protection. Her father's case had ended sterling. What happened in the barn was something else. Something that didn't end with a trial or an arrest. Something that kept going. Not finished, he'd written at the bottom of a page in a case file she'd carried from Chicago to Montana in the bottom of a saddlebag through a blizzard and down a cliff face and into a federal courthouse. She put the dollar back on the cord. She put it back where it belonged. Wes came up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood where she was standing and looked at what she was looking at. She said, "The night school. I'd like to expand it. Bring in proper books. Make it official," he said. "How official?" she said. "Registered with the Territorial Education Board. Open to anyone. Curriculum covering land rights, contract law, the basics of self-advocacy." She paused. "My father's case files, properly indexed, available to any homesteader or family in the valley who needs precedent for a claim." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a significant amount of work." She said, "Yes," he said. "You'd need help. A proper building. Not just the barn," she said. Eventually, he looked at the valley. He looked at her. He said, "All right." That was all. Dakota appeared at Wes's other shoulder, which was a habit of his that Cassidy had long stopped being surprised by. He had a plate of food in each hand. He handed them each one without ceremony. He said, "Erickson wants to know if he can use the East Field for a community grain store next season. Cooperative ownership. Valley family sharing cost and benefit." Cassidy said yes. Wes said yes. Dakota said good. He looked at the valley. That's how it starts. They stood there, the three of them, at the edge of the East Meadow on a May afternoon, with the wildflowers at their backs and the gold light of a Montana spring afternoon laying itself flat across everything below them, warm and long, turning the creek line and the fence posts and the cabin roof into something that looked, in that particular slant of light, like it was worth fighting for. It was. They'd proven that. One document at a time, one family at a time, one cold morning at a time on a ranch that had been dying and was now thoroughly, stubbornly, specifically alive. Cassidy ate her food. She watched her valley. She felt the weight of the silver dollar against her collarbone, small and warm and present, not finished. Just beginning, actually. She had a great deal of work left to do, and she was looking forward to every day of it. There's a moment early in this story that I keep coming back to. A tarnished silver dollar hitting a bar top in a smoky Montana saloon. $1. Not because Weston Gage was rich, he wasn't. Not because he had a plan, he didn't. He did it because he recognized something in a frightened young woman standing on a freight crate, something he'd felt himself on a battlefield in Virginia in the autumn of 1864. The particular terror of being cornered, of being reduced to something that simply reacts to whatever someone else decides to do to you. He'd been there, and he couldn't walk past it. That's the first lesson this story offers, and it's one the West doesn't always teach cleanly, that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply see another human being when everyone else has decided not to. West didn't rescue Cassidy Vance. He gave her a coat, a cup of coffee set on the floor several feet away, and an unloaded revolver to hold because sometimes the weight of a thing helps, even when the thing itself isn't ready to work yet. He gave her space and honesty and choice. Everything else, the survey documents, the legal arguments, the poultice in the mud, the cliff face and the blizzard, she did herself. And that brings us to the second lesson. The one Cassidy carries like her father's handwriting in the bottom of a saddlebag. Knowledge is the one weapon that multiplies when you share it. Arthur Vance, a Chicago attorney who believed women should understand the law because ignorance was a luxury that people without power couldn't afford, spent 4 years building a case that was meant to survive him. It did. His daughter carried it across half a continent, through grief and silence and a Montana winter, and she finished what he started. Not with a gun, with documentation, with patience, with the willingness to stand up in a room full of hostile witnesses and be unmistakably right. Sterling had power because he made himself the highest authority inside his county and then made the law too complicated for the people he was stealing from to understand. That was his strategy and ultimately his fatal miscalculation. Because the moment Cassidy sat down in that barn on a November night and began teaching 11 families the vocabulary of their own protection easements, surveys, adverse possession, how to read a deed, how to spot a fraudulent one, she was doing something Sterling had never planned for. She was making his weapon useless. One Tuesday night at a time, 40 people on hay bales at a stretch, by lantern light in a Montana winter. The third lesson is quieter, and maybe the most important. Dignity is not something you earn under good conditions. It's something you defend under bad ones. Cassidy Vance arrived in Oak Haven thin and frightened and silent, holding an iron fork in her coat pocket, because it was the only thing she had. She didn't ask for pity. She didn't perform gratitude. She sat at a table with a man's ledger books and found a legal time bomb in his mortgage documents inside 24 hours. She knelt in 6 inches of freezing mud in a cattle pen and wrote, on a notepad with her other hand, holding a sick animal's leg steady, "I am not porcelain. I have a right to work for this land alongside you." She said it without raising her voice or shedding a tear. She just said it because it was true. And truth stated plainly is harder to dismiss than any argument dressed up to impress. And Wes, a man of very few words and very consistent actions, heard it and said, "You're right. I'm sorry." Then he crouched down in the mud beside her and held the leg steady. That exchange, those 2 small moments, contain everything this story is really about. Not the land fraud or the courtroom or the mercenaries in the mountain pass, though all of that matters. What matters underneath it is this: 2 people choosing, repeatedly and under pressure, to treat each other as equals, to show up, to do the work without needing it acknowledged, to say true things plainly and trust the other person to hear them. This story is a work of historical fiction created purely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent real historical figures or actual events.